The barn was already burning when Daniel Carter realized he'd been betrayed. Flames roared into the frozen night sky, while an old woman he'd saved from death stood beside him, helpless against the inferno. By dawn, he would be in chains, accused of arson by the richest man in the territory, the same man who'd orchestrated murders for decades and hidden behind whispers of curses and superstition. But Silas Boone had made one fatal mistake. He'd underestimated the old widow everyone feared, because Margaret Doyle had 40 miles of frozen wilderness ahead of her, bleeding hands, and nothing left to lose. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you're here for a tale of courage against corruption, hit that like button and settle in. The dust never settled in Silver Creek. It hung in the autumn air like an accusation, drifting between the false-fronted buildings and wooden sidewalks of a town that thrived on other people's misery. Here, in this corner of the Montana Territory, where the mountains met the high plains, gossip was currency, and reputation could be destroyed faster than a man could draw his gun. Daniel Carter knew this better than most. He rode down Main Street on a gray October afternoon, his horse's hooves striking the hard-packed dirt in a steady rhythm that echoed off the buildings. 34 years old, weathered beyond his years, with dark hair touched with premature silver at the temples, and eyes that had forgotten how to show anything but careful neutrality. He wore his grief like his duster coat, close and protective, a barrier against a world that had taken everything that mattered. The townspeople watched him pass with the same careful distance they'd maintained for 6 years. 6 years since his wife Rebecca had died in childbirth, taking their daughter with her into whatever darkness waited beyond the last breath. 6 years since Daniel had stopped being part of Silver Creek's social fabric and become instead a ghost who haunted the edges of their community. A man who ranched alone on a valuable piece of land 12 miles from town and came in only when necessity demanded it. He'd just sold 30 head of cattle to the stockyard. The money sat heavy in his saddlebag, enough to see him through another winter of solitude. Daniel guided his horse toward the general store, intending to stock up on supplies before the long ride home. But as he passed the courthouse, a 2-story brick building that represented the full authority of territorial law in these parts, he saw something that made him pull up short. An old woman sat on the courthouse steps, alone. She was weeping, not the dramatic sobbing that demanded attention, but the quiet, hopeless crying of someone who'd forgotten that anyone might care enough to notice. Her hands covered her face, and her thin shoulders shook beneath a threadbare shawl that had once been black but had faded to the color of old ashes. Margaret Doyle. Even after 6 years of self-imposed isolation, Daniel knew that name. Everyone in Silver Creek knew that name. It was whispered with the same tone people used when speaking of plague or wildfire, things to be avoided, disasters that could spread if you got too close. The widow Doyle. The cursed woman. The killer. Never mind that she'd never been charged with a crime, never mind that no evidence had ever connected her to the deaths. In Silver Creek, the court of public opinion had convicted Margaret Doyle decades ago, and the sentence was lifetime exile from human kindness. 3 men who had cared for her had died. First, her husband Thomas, killed in what the sheriff ruled an accidental shooting while cleaning his rifle. Then her brother-in-law James, who'd taken her in afterward, dead from a fall down his own stairs just months later. Finally, old Samuel Wright, a kind neighbor who'd brought her firewood and groceries, found dead in his bed, his heart simply stopped. 3 deaths in 5 years. 3 men connected to 1 woman. The mathematics of tragedy had transformed into the algebra of superstition, and Silver Creek had solved for curse. That was 30 years ago. Margaret had been a young widow then, still in her 30s. Now she was old, somewhere past 60, with white hair and hands twisted by arthritis, and a face that had learned to expect nothing but cruelty from her fellow human beings. Daniel sat on his horse and watched her cry. Around him, the town flowed past as if she didn't exist. A woman with a basket crossed to the other side of the street rather than walk past the courthouse steps. 2 men who'd been heading toward the building's front entrance saw Margaret and chose instead to go around to the side door. A group of children playing in the street fell silent when they noticed her, then scattered like startled birds. It was as if she were invisible, or worse, as if she were visible but had ceased to matter in any human sense. Daniel remembered that feeling, That particular species of loneliness that came from being surrounded by people who looked through you as if you were made of glass. He'd felt it every day for 6 years, the weight of pity and discomfort that made conversations die and made people suddenly remember urgent business elsewhere whenever he appeared. But what they'd done to him was mercy compared to what they'd done to Margaret Doyle. He should ride on. He had supplies to buy, a long trip home ahead of him, and no desire to paint a target on his own back by associating with Silver Creek's designated pariah. The smart thing would be to pretend he hadn't seen her. Daniel dismounted. His boots struck the boardwalk with hollow sounds that seemed too loud in the October quiet. He walked toward the courthouse steps, aware of eyes on him, aware that every person on Main Street had suddenly stopped whatever they were doing to watch. Let them watch. He reached the steps and stood there for a moment, looking down at the old woman who hadn't noticed his approach. Up close, he could see the details that distance had hidden, the patches on her dress, carefully sewn but clearly visible, the worn-through soles of her shoes, the way her hands shook with more than just the force of her tears. "Ma'am?" Margaret's head came up sharply, her eyes red and wet and full of a wild, cornered fear that hit Daniel like a physical blow. She'd been hurt so many times that even kindness looked like the beginning of another assault. "I didn't do nothing," she said quickly, her voice hoarse. "I was just sitting here. I wasn't bothering nobody." "I know." Daniel reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a handkerchief, clean, folded, one of the few civilized things he still maintained in his solitary life. He held it out to her. "You dropped this." It was a lie, and they both knew it. Margaret stared at the handkerchief, as if it might transform into a snake. Her eyes moved from the white cloth to Daniel's face and back again, searching for the trap, the cruelty hiding inside the gesture. "I didn't drop nothing," she whispered. "Yes, you did." Daniel kept his hand extended, steady. "Just now, I saw it fall." The lie was a gift, he realized. A way for her to accept kindness without having to acknowledge her own need for it. A way to preserve some small shred of dignity in a town that had spent 30 years stripping her of it piece by piece. Slowly, as if expecting him to snatch it away at the last second, Margaret reached out and took the handkerchief. Her fingers were cold when they brushed his. "Thank you," she said, so quietly he almost didn't hear it. Daniel nodded. He should say something else, something comforting or wise. But he'd been alone too long, had forgotten how to do this, how to be human with another person who was drowning in the same dark water that had swallowed him. So instead, he just tipped his hat and turned away. Behind him, he heard Margaret blow her nose, a small, wet sound that somehow contained more honesty than most of the words spoken in Silver Creek on any given day. Daniel walked back to his horse, aware of the silence that had fallen over Main Street, aware of the stares, the whispers that would start the moment he was out of earshot. Carter's finally lost his mind. 6 years alone will do that to a man. Getting mixed up with the cursed widow, nothing good can come of that. He didn't care. Let them talk. They'd been talking about him for years anyway. One act of basic human decency wasn't going to make things worse than they already were. He swung into the saddle and guided his horse toward the general store, deliberately not looking back at the courthouse steps. Not giving the town the satisfaction of seeing him second-guess himself, but he could feel Margaret's eyes on him as he rode away. That was the first time. The moment that meant nothing and everything. The handkerchief and the lie and the simple acknowledgement that she existed, that her tears mattered, that she was still human enough to deserve the smallest gesture of kindness. Daniel Carter didn't know it yet, but that moment had just set in motion a chain of events that would cost him nearly everything and give him back something he thought he'd lost forever. The general store smelled of coffee and leather and the sharp tang of kerosene. Daniel moved through the familiar aisles, gathering supplies with the efficiency of a man who'd made this trip 100 times. Flour, sugar, coffee, salt pork, ammunition for his rifle. The basics of survival, nothing more. Jeremiah Hobbs, who owned the store, tallied up the purchases with the careful neutrality of a man who'd learned not to engage too deeply with difficult customers. "That'll be $17.40. Daniel counted out the money from his cattle sale, aware of the other customers in the store. 2 women examining fabric bolts had fallen silent when he'd entered. Now they whispered to each other behind their hands, shooting glances in his direction that weren't quite subtle enough. Saw you talking to the widow, Jeremiah said, his voice carefully casual as he wrapped the supplies in brown paper. Out on the courthouse steps. There it was. Less than 15 minutes and already the gossip had made its way here. I gave her a handkerchief, Daniel said flatly. Didn't realize that was a crime. Ain't a crime. Jeremiah tied off the package with string. Just unusual. Most folks keep their distance from Margaret Doyle. Most folks are cruel. The words came out harder than Daniel had intended. In the sudden quiet that followed, he could hear the whispers from the fabric corners stop entirely, could feel the weight of judgment pressing down like a physical thing. Jeremiah's face closed off. Just trying to look out for you, Carter. That woman's got a history. So do I. Daniel picked up his packages. So does everyone in this town. Difference is, I don't hold it against people. He walked out before Jeremiah could respond, shouldering through the door and back into the October afternoon. The sun was lower now, painting the false fronts of the buildings in shades of amber and gold that made everything look warmer than it was. Daniel secured his supplies to his saddle, aware that the two women from the store had followed him out and were watching from the boardwalk. Aware that across the street, a group of men standing outside the Silver Creek Saloon had stopped their conversation to stare. The whole town was watching. Good. Let them see that one man, at least, wasn't afraid of an old woman's tears. He swung into the saddle and turned his horse toward home, riding down Main Street with his back straight and his eyes forward. He passed the courthouse again. Margaret was gone now, the steps empty except for the dust that never settled, and continued on toward the edge of town. That's when he saw the rider coming in from the opposite direction, Silas Boone. Even from a distance, there was no mistaking him. He sat his horse like a king surveying his kingdom, and in many ways that's exactly what he was. Richest man in the territory, owner of the Broken Star Ranch, 40,000 acres of prime grazing land that sprawled across the valley like an empire. Boone controlled the bank, had the sheriff in his pocket, and owned enough politicians to make territorial law bend in whatever direction served his interests. He was 60 years old, barrel-chested and bull-strong, with silver hair and cold blue eyes and the kind of face that smiled easily, but never with any warmth. Daniel had dealt with him before. For the past 3 years, Silas Boone had been trying to buy Daniel's ranch. It wasn't the land itself that Boone wanted. 1,200 acres was nothing compared to the Broken Star's holdings. It was the location. The railroad surveyors had been through 2 years ago, mapping out where the new line from Denver to Helena would run, and Daniel's property sat directly in the path. The ranch that Daniel had built with Rebecca, where he'd planned to raise their daughter, where he'd buried his dreams in the same ground where he grazed his cattle, that land was now worth a fortune to anyone willing to sell. Daniel had refused every offer. Boone had not taken it well. Now the big man reined in his horse directly in Daniel's path, forcing him to stop. Behind Boone rode 2 of his men, Cole and Travis, hard cases who wore their guns low and their loyalty for sale to the highest bidder. Carter. Boone's voice was smooth, cultured, the accent of education and privilege. Heard you had a good sale today at the stockyard. Good enough. 30 head at $40 each. Boone smiled. That's $1,200. Minus the stockyard's commission, you cleared about $1,000. Should keep you comfortable through the winter. The fact that Boone knew the exact details of his business dealings shouldn't have surprised Daniel. The stockyard manager probably reported directly to Boone. Most business owners in Silver Creek did. What do you want, Silas? Same thing I've wanted for 3 years. Boone leaned forward in his saddle, his smile never wavering. I want to buy your ranch, and I'm prepared to make you an offer that's more than generous. $15,000 for your land, buildings, and livestock. That's more than twice what it's worth. It was, Daniel had to admit. By any reasonable standard, it was an excellent offer. No. Boone's smile tightened. You're a stubborn man, Carter. I respect that. But stubbornness without sense is just foolishness. That railroad's coming through whether you sell or not. When it does, the territory will exercise eminent domain and take your land anyway. You'll get maybe a quarter of what I'm offering now. Then I'll deal with that when it happens. Why? Boone's voice sharpened. What's keeping you on that property? Your wife's dead. Your daughter's dead. You live out there alone like a hermit, working yourself into an early grave for what? Memories? Daniel's hands tightened on the reins. Around them, Main Street had gone quiet again. More witnesses to Silas Boone's public attempt to bend Daniel Carter to his will. "My reasons are my own," Daniel said softly, "and they're none of your business. Everything in this valley is my business." Boone's facade of friendliness dropped away, revealing the granite underneath. "You're making a mistake, Carter. A bad one. And I don't like it when people make bad decisions that affect my interests." "That sounds like a threat." "It's a warning." Boone gathered his reins. "Take the deal. Sell me the ranch, because the alternative is going to cost you a lot more than pride." He rode past without waiting for a response, his men following behind like well-trained dogs. Daniel sat motionless in the middle of Main Street, watching them go, his jaw clenched so tight his teeth ached. Around him, Silver Creek slowly came back to life. Conversations resumed, people went back to their business, but Daniel could feel the speculation in the air, thick as the dust. Boone's going to crush him. Should have taken the money. Stubborn fool's going to lose everything. Maybe they were right. Probably they were right. But that ranch was all he had left of Rebecca, of the life they'd planned together, of the dreams that had died with her. Selling it would be like admitting that none of it had mattered, that love and loss could be reduced to a dollar figure and a legal document. He'd rather die than do that. Daniel rode out of Silver Creek as the sun touched the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of fire. The road home stretched before him, familiar and lonely, leading to a cabin where no one waited and no light burned in the windows. Behind him, the town faded into twilight and dust. Ahead, winter was coming. 3 days later, the weather turned. Daniel woke before dawn to a silence that felt wrong. Too complete, too heavy, like the world was holding its breath. He dressed quickly in the cold cabin, pulling on wool trousers and a heavy shirt, and stepped outside into a morning that had transformed overnight. Snow. Not the light dustings that occasionally touched the valley in late autumn, but real snow. Thick flakes falling from a sky the color of old iron, already covering the ground in a blanket of white that erased all the familiar landmarks. The first serious storm of the season. Daniel stood on his porch and watched the snow fall, feeling the temperature drop with each passing minute. This was going to be bad. He could feel it in his bones, in the way the wind had shifted to come screaming down from the mountains with an edge that cut straight through his coat. He had work to do. For the next several hours, Daniel moved through the brutal efficiency of storm preparation. He brought the horses into the barn, making sure they had enough hay and water to last through what could be days of confinement. He checked the cattle in the near pasture, counting heads and driving them toward the shelter of the cottonwood grove where they'd be protected from the worst of the wind. He stacked extra firewood on the porch, filled every container he owned with water from the pump, and made sure his supplies were organized and accessible. By noon, the world had vanished into a wall of white. The wind howled like something alive and angry, driving the snow sideways so hard it stung exposed skin like thrown gravel. Visibility had dropped to maybe 20 feet. The temperature was plummeting. Daniel guessed it was already below zero and still falling. This was the kind of storm that killed people. He was securing the barn door when he saw something moving on the road. At first he thought it was his imagination, or maybe one of his cattle that had wandered away from the herd. But as the shape stumbled closer, fighting against the wind, Daniel realized with a shock that it was a person. Someone was out in this storm, on foot, dying. Daniel didn't think. He ran toward the struggling figure, fighting his way through snow that was already knee-deep in places, the wind trying to knock him sideways with every step. The cold burned in his lungs, turned his exposed skin numb within seconds. The person collapsed just as Daniel reached them. He grabbed an arm, tried to pull them up, and realized two things simultaneously. First, it was a woman. Second, he knew her. Margaret Doyle. She was barely conscious, her lips blue, her eyes glazed and unfocused. Ice had formed in her white hair and on her eyelashes. She wore the same threadbare shawl she'd had on the courthouse steps, now crusted with snow and frozen solid. She'd been walking from town, 12 miles in a blizzard that would have killed a healthy man in half that distance. "Can you walk?" Daniel shouted over the wind. Margaret's mouth moved, but no sound came out. Daniel didn't wait for an answer. He picked her up. She weighed almost nothing, just brittle bones wrapped in frozen cloth, and carried her toward the cabin. The wind fought him every step, trying to tear her from his arms, trying to drive him to his knees. Snow filled his eyes, his mouth, his lungs. He made it to the porch more by memory than sight, kicked the door open, and stumbled inside. The cabin's warmth hit him like a wall. Daniel carried Margaret to the chair closest to the stove and set her down carefully. Her eyes were closed now, her breathing so shallow he had to lean close to make sure she was still alive. Hypothermia. Severe. Daniel had seen it before, had treated men who'd been caught in winter storms during his years working cattle drives before he'd settled in Montana. He knew the signs, knew what needed to be done. He stripped off Margaret's frozen clothing, the shawl, the dress, the thin undergarments that had provided no protection at all, with clinical efficiency, wrapping her instead in every blanket he owned. He built up the fire in the stove until the cast iron glowed red. He heated water and managed to get some of it down her throat, just a few drops at a time. Then he waited. Outside, the storm raged. Inside, an old woman who should have been dead fought for each breath. Hours passed. The cabin grew almost unbearably warm from the roaring fire, but Margaret continued to shake with violent tremors that made her teeth chatter and her whole body convulse. Daniel stayed beside her, adding more blankets when she seemed to be losing ground, spooning more warm water into her mouth when she could swallow. Twilight came early, the storm-dark sky bleeding into night without any visible transition. Daniel lit the oil lamps, their warm glow pushing back the darkness, but doing nothing to reduce the howl of the wind outside. Finally, near midnight, Margaret's eyes opened. They were clearer now, focused, aware. She looked around the cabin with confused recognition, her gaze eventually settling on Daniel sitting in the chair across from her. "You," she whispered. Her voice was rough, damaged by the cold. "The man with the handkerchief. Daniel Carter." He leaned forward. "How do you feel?" "Cold." A pause. "But alive. I shouldn't be alive." "No," Daniel agreed. "You shouldn't. What were you doing out there?" Margaret's eyes filled with tears, a different kind than the ones he'd seen on the courthouse steps. These were exhausted, defeated, the tears of someone who'd finally run out of strength. "Had nowhere else to go," she said. "They threw me out." "Who did?" "Mrs. Patterson. I've been renting a room from her for near on 10 years. But her daughter came to visit from back east, and the daughter said she wouldn't stay in the same house as me. Said I made her nervous. Said I was cursed." Margaret's hands clenched in the blankets. "Mrs. Patterson gave me till this morning to clear out." "In this weather?" "Weather turned after I left. Wasn't snowing when I started walking. Didn't have nowhere to go anyway, so I just kept walking." She looked at Daniel with eyes that held no hope, no expectation of help. "You should have left me out there. Would have been kinder." "I don't believe in kindness through abandonment." "Most folks do. Most folks think the kindest thing they can do for me is pretend I don't exist." Her voice broke. "Maybe they're right. Maybe I am cursed. 3 good men died because of me." "They died near you?" Daniel corrected gently. "That's not the same thing." Margaret stared at him. "You don't know what you're talking about. I know that good people die for no reason at all." Daniel's voice went rough. "I know that sometimes the world is just cruel and there's no curse involved, no cosmic justice, just bad luck and worse timing. And I know that punishing you for 30 years because you had the misfortune to be close to tragedy is the real crime." She said nothing for a long moment. Outside, the wind continued its assault on the cabin, rattling the windows and finding every crack in the walls to whistle through. "Why?" Margaret finally asked. "Why did you help me?" Daniel thought about that. Thought about the handkerchief and the lie, and the way the whole town had looked through this old woman as if she didn't exist. "Because someone should," he said simply. Margaret's face crumpled. She turned away, her shoulders shaking, and Daniel realized she was crying again, but this time from something other than despair, from the shock of being treated like a human being. He let her cry, understanding that some grief needed no witness and no comfort. He stood and moved to the window, looking out at the storm that showed no signs of letting up. The snow was so thick now that he couldn't see past the porch railing. They were trapped here together until the weather broke. Daniel wondered what the town would say when they found out. Then he decided he didn't care. Behind him, Margaret's crying slowly faded into exhausted silence. When he turned around, she'd fallen asleep, her face peaceful for perhaps the first time in decades. Daniel added more wood to the fire and settled into his chair to keep watch through the night. The storm had brought him a guest, and whether Silver Creek liked it or not, she was staying until it was safe for her to leave. The storm lasted 3 days. 3 days of wind that screamed like a living thing and snow that fell so thick the world disappeared into white emptiness. 3 days trapped together in a cabin built for solitude, two people who knew loneliness like their own heartbeat suddenly forced into proximity that felt both awkward and strangely necessary. On the first full day, Margaret barely spoke. She sat wrapped in blankets near the stove, her eyes following Daniel as he moved through the cabin's routines, cooking simple meals of salt pork and beans, feeding the fire, checking the windows where snow had drifted nearly to the sills. She watched him with the wary intensity of a wild animal that had been caught but not yet tamed, waiting for the moment when kindness would transform into cruelty. Daniel gave her space. He understood that trust wasn't built with words, but with the steady accumulation of small mercies. So he made coffee and poured her a cup without asking if she wanted it. He cooked extra food and set a plate beside her without comment. He kept the fire burning and the cabin warm and asked nothing in return except that she rest and recover. By the second day, Margaret had regained enough strength to sit up without assistance. The blue tinge had faded from her lips, and though her hands still shook when she held her coffee cup, it was from age and arthritis rather than hypothermia. "You got a wife?" she asked suddenly, breaking hours of silence. Daniel was at the stove, stirring a pot of stew. He went very still. "Had one. She died 6 years ago." "I'm sorry." Margaret's voice was soft. "Childbirth? How did you know?" "I'm old, not blind. I seen the cradle in the corner, all carved up with flowers and birds. Seen how you look at it sometimes when you think nobody's watching. A man doesn't keep a cradle for 6 years unless it means something terrible." Daniel set down the wooden spoon and turned to face her. "Her name was Rebecca. Our daughter was going to be called Sarah. Rebecca died bringing her into the world, and Sarah followed 2 hours later. The doctor said sometimes babies just aren't strong enough, but I think Sarah knew her mama was gone and decided she didn't want to stay without her." The words came easier than he'd expected. Maybe because Margaret was a stranger. Maybe because she carried her own grief like a familiar coat and wouldn't try to diminish his with platitudes about time healing or being in a better place. "That's a hard thing," Margaret said. "The kind of hard that doesn't get easier, just gets quieter." "Yes." "Is that why you live out here alone? Why the whole town treats you like a ghost?" "I treat them the same way." Daniel returned to the stove. "After Rebecca died, people wanted to help. They brought food, offered sympathy, invited me to church socials and Sunday dinners. But they wanted me to grieve the way they thought was proper. They wanted me to cry at the right moments and smile at the right moments, and after a few months they wanted me to be done with it, move on, find another wife, start another family." He ladled stew into 2 bowls, the steam rising in fragrant clouds. "When I didn't do what they expected, when I kept grieving in my own way and on my own time, they got uncomfortable, stopped inviting me places, stopped visiting. Eventually stopped talking to me except when business required it." He brought the bowls to the table. "Turns out people are only comfortable with grief when it fits into their schedule." Margaret accepted the bowl, her twisted fingers curling around the warm ceramic. "At least they were kind at first. At least they tried." "What happened to you?" Daniel sat across from her. "If you want to tell it." She was quiet for so long he thought she'd refuse. But then she started talking, her voice low and measured, as if she were reading from a book of horrors she'd memorized long ago. "I married Thomas Doyle when I was 19. He was a good man, strong and gentle, and we were happy. Not rich, but happy. We had 3 years together before he died." She paused, staring into her stew without eating. "The sheriff said it was an accident. Thomas was cleaning his rifle and it went off, shot him in the chest. He was dead before I could get to him." "I'm sorry. I was destroyed. Couldn't hardly function. Thomas's brother James took me in, let me stay in his house while I figured out what to do next. James was married with 2 children, and his wife was kind to me. They all were." Her hands tightened on the bowl. "Then one night, 6 months after Thomas died, I heard a crash downstairs. Found James at the bottom of the stairs with his neck broken. The sheriff ruled it an accident, said he must have tripped in the dark." Daniel said nothing, but he could see where this was going, could see the shape of the tragedy taking form. James's wife asked me to leave after the funeral. She didn't say it was my fault, but I could see it in her eyes. She was afraid. So I found a room in town, tried to make a living taking in sewing and laundry. That's when Samuel Wright started helping me. Old bachelor who lived down the street. He'd bring me firewood, sometimes a chicken from his coop, just small kindnesses. Margaret's voice cracked. 3 months later, he was dead. Heart attack in his sleep. He was only 52. 3 men in 5 years. The town did the mathematics and decided I was the common factor. Started calling me cursed. Started crossing the street when they saw me coming. Women pulled their children inside when I walked past. Men wouldn't look me in the eye. She finally looked up at Daniel, her eyes dry but haunted. That was 30 years ago. 30 years of people treating me like I carry death in my pockets. You know it wasn't your fault. Do I? Margaret's laugh was bitter. I've had 3 decades to think about it, Daniel. 3 decades of wondering if maybe they're right. If maybe there's something wrong with me, something broken or cursed or evil that kills the people who get too close. That's what they want you to think. That's how cruelty works. It makes you believe you deserve it. Maybe I do. No. Daniel's voice was hard. Nobody deserves 30 years of exile for the crime of being nearby when bad things happen. That's not justice. That's just fear looking for a target. Margaret studied him across the table. This man who'd saved her life and was now defending her against demons she'd carried for longer than he'd been alive. Why aren't you afraid of me? She asked softly. Because I've learned that the things we fear most are rarely the things that actually hurt us. Daniel picked up his spoon. The town was afraid you'd bring them bad luck, so they spent 30 years being cruel to an innocent woman. Seems to me the real curse is what fear does to good people. They ate in silence after that, but it was a different kind of silence. Less wary, less sharp. Something had shifted between them. Some invisible wall had developed a crack. Outside, the storm continued its assault, but inside the cabin, warmth held against the cold. That night, Margaret slept in Daniel's bed, while he took the floor near the stove. She'd protested, but he'd insisted, and eventually exhaustion had won over propriety. As Daniel lay wrapped in blankets listening to the wind howl, he found himself thinking about loneliness and how strange it was to have another person in his space after so many years alone. Strange, but not unwelcome. By the 3rd day, the storm was dying. The wind had lost its fury, dropping from a scream to a moan. The snow still fell, but lighter now, almost gentle. Through the window, Daniel could see the first hints of gray sky behind the clouds. Margaret was stronger. She'd helped him cook breakfast, eggs and the last of the bacon, coffee strong enough to strip paint. Now she sat at the table folding the blankets she'd used, her movements slow but steady. Storm will break by tonight, Daniel said, looking out at the transformed landscape. Snow had buried everything, drifting as high as the porch railing in places. Tomorrow I'll need to dig out, check on the cattle, make sure the barn's still standing. And then I'll leave. It wasn't a question. Daniel turned from the window. Where will you go? I don't know. Margaret's hand stilled on the blanket. I got nowhere, really. No family left, no friends. The room I was renting is gone, and I don't have money for another place even if someone would take me. You could stay here. The words surprised him as much as they surprised her. They hung in the air between them, impossible and necessary. That's not funny, Margaret said. I'm not joking. Daniel, you can't. The town already thinks you're strange for living out here alone. If they find out you took me in, they'll turn on you the way they turned on me. Let them. You don't understand what that's like, what it costs. I understand better than you think. Daniel moved to the table, sat down across from her. I've been alone for 6 years, Margaret. 6 years of silence and empty rooms and conversations with horses, because they're the only living things that don't judge me for not being over my grief yet. You know what I've learned? She shook her head. That loneliness is a choice, not the being alone part. Sometimes circumstances force that on us. But the staying alone, the accepting it as permanent, that's a choice. He gestured around the cabin. I got more space than I need, more work than one person can handle. And after 3 days of having someone else here, I've remembered something I'd forgotten. What's that? That being human means being connected to other humans, even broken ones, maybe especially broken ones. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. You'd really let me stay? Even knowing what it would cost you? What's it going to cost me that I haven't already lost? My reputation. Already gone. The town's good opinion? Never had it. Their business? Daniel shrugged. I sell cattle at market, not to my neighbors. They can think whatever they want. Silas Boone won't like it. It was the first time she'd mentioned Boone specifically, and Daniel felt something cold settle in his stomach. What does Boone have to do with this? Margaret looked away, her jaw tight. Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. I don't know for certain, just suspicions. Things that never quite added up. Tell me. She was quiet for a long moment, wrestling with something. Finally she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Thomas, my husband. The day he died, he'd come back from town all agitated. Said he'd had words with Silas Boone about some land. Thomas owned a small ranch back then. Nothing fancy, but it sat right where Boone wanted to expand. Thomas had refused to sell, and Boone had threatened him. Margaret's hands twisted in the blanket. 3 hours later, Thomas was dead. Accidental shooting while cleaning his rifle. Could have been a coincidence. Could have been. And James, my brother-in-law. He'd taken over Thomas's ranch after he died, and Boone came to him with the same offer. James refused too. Said the land was family property, and he'd be damned if he'd sell it to a land-grabbing bastard. Her voice shook. 2 weeks later, James fell down the stairs. Broken neck. Another accident. Daniel felt ice spreading through his veins. And Samuel Wright? Samuel was the one who told me he didn't believe in accidents. He'd been asking questions, poking around, trying to figure out what really happened to Thomas and James. He told me he was going to the territorial marshal with what he'd found. Margaret looked up, her eyes haunted. He died that night. Heart attack in his sleep. The doctor said it was natural causes, but Samuel was healthy as a horse the day before. You think Boone killed them? I think Boone wanted their land and they were in his way, and then they were dead. I think the whole town decided it was easier to blame a curse than to accuse the richest man in the territory of murder. Her voice turned bitter. I think they made me a monster, so they didn't have to face the real monster living in the biggest house in the valley. Daniel sat back, his mind racing. It made a horrible kind of sense. Boone had spent 3 years trying to buy Daniel's ranch, and his offers had grown progressively more aggressive. The threats had been subtle but clear. The railroad line, Daniel said slowly. That's what this is about. Thomas's ranch, James's property, were they in the path of the proposed railroad? Margaret nodded. Samuel figured it out before he died. He said Boone had known about the railroad for years before anyone else, before the surveyors even came through. Said Boone had inside information from the territorial government and was buying up land along the route to sell back to the railroad at enormous profit. And anyone who wouldn't sell died accidentally. Margaret's hands were shaking again. I can't prove any of it. Samuel had evidence, but it disappeared after he died. The sheriff, who works for Boone, ruled everything natural causes or accidents, and the town was so eager to believe in curses that they never questioned it. Daniel stood and walked to the window, staring out at the white wilderness. The pieces were falling into place, forming a picture that was both clear and terrifying. If Margaret was right, Silas Boone was a murderer. A man who'd killed at least 3 people and framed an innocent woman with superstition and fear to cover his crimes. A man who now wanted Daniel's land and had already made it clear he didn't respond well to being refused. When the town finds out you're staying here, Daniel said quietly, Boone is going to hear about it within hours. He's going to know we've been talking. He's going to wonder what you've told me. Which is why I should leave, tonight, as soon as the storm breaks. I'll head west, find some other town where nobody knows my name. Margaret stood, wrapped the blanket around her shoulders. I won't bring this down on you, Daniel. You've been kind to me, kinder than anyone in 30 years, and I won't repay that by making you Boone's next target. You're not going anywhere. Didn't you hear what I just said? This man is dangerous. I heard you, and I'm telling you that I'm not afraid of Silas Boone. Daniel turned from the window. You said loneliness is about being invisible, about people looking through you like you don't exist. Well, I'm done being invisible. I'm done letting bullies and cowards dictate how I live my life. And I'm damn sure done letting an old woman freeze to death because some land-grabbing murderer might not like it. Margaret stared at him. You're either the bravest man I've ever met or the most foolish. Probably both. Daniel managed a thin smile. But the offer stands. You can stay here as long as you want. Help me run the ranch, earn your keep, build a life that doesn't involve running or hiding or apologizing for existing. And if Boone doesn't like it, he can come tell me himself. He will, Margaret said softly. And when he does, he won't come with words. Then I'll be ready. They stood facing each other across the cabin, two damaged souls who'd found an unexpected alliance in the teeth of a Montana blizzard. Outside, the snow had stopped falling. The clouds were breaking apart, revealing patches of pale blue sky. The storm was over. But Daniel suspected that another storm, far more dangerous, was just beginning. That night, after Margaret had gone to bed, Daniel sat at his table cleaning his rifle. The Winchester gleamed in the lamplight, each piece familiar under his practiced hands. He'd bought this rifle the year he married Rebecca, had used it to hunt elk and deer to feed his family, to protect his livestock from wolves and cougars. He'd never used it on a man. The thought sat heavy in his mind as he reassembled the weapon, loaded it, and set it within easy reach of the door. He wasn't a violent man, wasn't a fighter. But he was beginning to understand that some fights found you whether you wanted them or not. If Margaret was right, and every instinct told him she was, then Silas Boone had murdered 3 people and destroyed an innocent woman's life to build his empire. And now Daniel stood directly between Boone and another piece of that empire. The mathematics were simple and brutal. Daniel added wood to the fire and settled into his chair, the rifle across his lap, watching the darkness beyond the window. Tomorrow he'd dig out from the storm, check the cattle, repair any damage, return to the normal rhythms of ranch life. But normal was over. The moment he'd stopped on those courthouse steps and offered a handkerchief to a crying old woman, he'd set something in motion that couldn't be stopped. The moment he'd brought Margaret Doyle into his home, he'd declared war on 30 years of lies and fear. And men like Silas Boone didn't respond to declarations of war with anything but violence. Daniel dozed in his chair as the night deepened, the rifle heavy in his hands, waiting for tomorrow and whatever it would bring. The dawn came cold and crystalline, the sun rising over a landscape transformed into something alien and beautiful. Snow covered everything, smooth and white and perfect, erasing all the familiar boundaries and landmarks. The sky was painfully blue, the kind of blue that only came after major storms, and the air was so cold it burned going into the lungs. Daniel was outside before full light, digging paths from the cabin to the barn, from the barn to the well. Margaret appeared on the porch, wrapped in blankets, watching him work. "I can help," she called. "Not yet. You're still recovering." "I'm not made of glass." But she didn't argue further, and Daniel was grateful. The work was brutal, the snow heavy and deep, and his back was aching by the time he'd cleared enough space to be functional. He checked on the horses, both fine, restless from days of confinement, but unharmed. The barn had weathered the storm well, only a few shingles torn loose. The cattle were another story. Daniel saddled his horse and rode out into the white wilderness, searching for his herd. He found them eventually, huddled in the cottonwood grove where they'd sought shelter. Most had survived, but 3 calves had frozen to death during the worst of the storm, and 1 old cow had broken her leg in a drift and would have to be put down. He did what was necessary with the cow, the rifle shot echoing across the empty valley like thunder. The sound seemed to hang in the air longer than it should have, a reminder of how far sound traveled in the winter silence. A reminder that anyone listening would know exactly where he was. Daniel dragged the dead cow away from the herd. The carcass would feed coyotes and ravens through the winter, and counted heads. 27 cattle left. Not enough to make a profit this year, but enough to survive on if he was careful. He rode back to the cabin as the sun climbed toward noon, his horse's breath steaming in the frozen air. Margaret had managed to get a fire going in the outdoor pit and was heating water in a large pot. "Laundry," she said when she saw his expression. "Your clothes smell like cow and wood smoke, and mine aren't much better. Figure if I'm staying, I might as well make myself useful." "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to. I want to." She stirred the pot with a long stick. "I've spent 30 years being useless, Daniel, being a burden, being something people step around or ignore. Let me do this. Let me help." He dismounted, studying her. She looked stronger today, more solid, as if 3 days of food and warmth and safety had begun rebuilding what decades of cruelty had torn down. "All right," he said, "but pace yourself. This altitude takes getting used to." They worked through the afternoon, falling into a rhythm that felt natural despite being new. Margaret washed clothes while Daniel repaired the damage to the barn roof. She cooked dinner while he fed the horses. They moved around each other with the careful courtesy of strangers becoming allies. As twilight fell, they sat at the table eating venison stew and fresh bread that Margaret had somehow managed to bake in Daniel's ancient cast-iron oven. "This is good," Daniel said, surprised at how much he'd missed bread that wasn't hardtack. "My mama taught me. Said a woman who could bake bread would never starve." Margaret broke off a piece, chewing slowly. Of course, she also said a woman should marry young and have lots of babies and never speak out of turn, so maybe her advice wasn't all perfect. Daniel smiled, a real smile, the first in longer than he could remember. "My Rebecca couldn't bake worth a damn. Burned everything she touched, but she could rope a steer faster than any cowhand I ever met, and she could read the weather like she had a direct line to the sky." "You loved her." "Still do." The admission came easier now. "Death doesn't change that. Just changes where I direct it." They ate in comfortable silence, and Daniel realized this was what he'd been missing. Not romance or passion, but simple human companionship, someone to share meals with, someone to talk to about small things, bread and weather and the day's work, without the weight of grief making every conversation a minefield. He was clearing the table when he heard it. Hoofbeats. Multiple riders, coming fast. Daniel's hand went automatically to the rifle he'd kept close all day. Margaret heard it too, her face going pale, her hands gripping the table edge. "Get away from the windows," Daniel said quietly. She obeyed without question, moving to the corner of the cabin where the shadows were deepest. Daniel positioned himself near the door, the Winchester loaded and ready. The riders came into the yard in a thunder of hooves and shouting. Through the window, Daniel counted 5 men. Even in the failing light, he recognized them. Silas Boone, sitting his horse like a king. The sheriff, a weak-chinned man named Porter who'd been in Boone's pocket for years. And 3 of Boone's ranch hands, Cole, Travis, and a man Daniel didn't recognize. They spread out in a loose semicircle facing the cabin, their horses stamping and snorting, breath steaming in the cold air. Daniel stepped out onto the porch, the rifle held casual but ready. "Silas, Sheriff, little late for a social call." Boone's smile was all teeth and no warmth. "Heard you had a visitor, Carter. Thought we'd come check on your hospitality." "My hospitality is my business, not when it involves a woman wanted for questioning." The sheriff leaned forward in his saddle, trying for authority and failing. "Margaret Doyle was reported missing after the storm. We got concerns about her welfare." "She's fine." "That's so?" Boone's eyes were cold. "Then you won't mind if we come in and verify that. Make sure she's here of her own free will and not being held against her wishes." Daniel's hands tightened on the rifle. "She's a guest in my home, and she's staying until she decides to leave. That's all the verification you need." "I'm afraid it's not that simple." The sheriff reached into his coat, pulled out a folded paper. "I got a warrant here for Mrs. Doyle's arrest. She's wanted for questioning in connection with the deaths of Thomas Doyle, James Doyle, and Samuel Wright." The absurdity was stunning. 30 years after the fact, and they were suddenly interested in investigating deaths they'd already ruled accidental. "Those deaths were ruled accidents," Daniel said. "You know it, I know it, and everyone in Silver Creek knows it." "New evidence has come to light." Boone's voice was smooth. "Evidence suggesting Mrs. Doyle may have had more involvement than previously thought. The territorial authorities have asked us to bring her in." It was a lie, and they all knew it, but it was a lie backed by guns and badges and the power of wealth. "She's not going anywhere," Daniel said flatly. The rider shifted, hands moving toward weapons. The moment balanced on a knife edge. Then Margaret stepped out onto the porch. "It's all right, Daniel." Her voice was steady, resigned. "I'll go with them." "No." "Yes." She looked at him with eyes that had seen this moment coming for 30 years. "Because if I don't, they'll kill you. And I won't have that on my conscience along with everything else." "Listen to the woman," Boone said. "She's being sensible." Daniel wanted to refuse, wanted to tell them all to go to hell. But Margaret was right. These men had come ready for violence, and refusing would only give them an excuse. "I'll ride into town tomorrow," he said. "Talk to the territorial marshal myself about this so-called new evidence." "You do that." Boone's smile widened. "I'm sure the marshal will be very interested in your concerns." Margaret walked past Daniel, down the porch steps toward the waiting horses. The sheriff dismounted and took her arm, not roughly, but firmly enough to make his point. As they helped her onto a horse, Margaret looked back at Daniel one last time. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything." Then they rode away into the gathering darkness, taking with them the first friend Daniel had made in 6 years. He stood on the porch long after they disappeared, the rifle hanging loose in his hands, fury and helplessness warring in his chest. Silas Boone had just made his move, and Daniel was going to have to figure out how to counter it before Margaret paid the price for his kindness. Daniel didn't sleep that night. He sat at his table with the oil lamp burning low, turning possibilities over in his mind like cards in a losing hand. Every scenario ended the same way, with Margaret in a cell and Silas Boone smiling that cold smile, knowing he'd won another round in a game Daniel hadn't even realized he was playing. By dawn, his decision was made. He saddled his horse in the gray pre-light, checking the rifle in its scabbard and the revolver at his hip. The ride to Silver Creek would take 3 hours if he pushed hard, and he intended to push hard. Margaret had spent 1 night in that jail, and he'd be damned if she spent a second. The valley stretched before him in shades of white and shadow, beautiful and merciless. The cold bit through his coat as his horse's hooves broke the frozen crust of snow, each step a sharp crack in the winter silence. Daniel rode with his mind working, planning arguments and appeals, trying to figure out how to fight a man who owned the sheriff and probably half the territorial government. He was halfway to town when he saw the smoke, a thin column rising from behind the ridge that sheltered his ranch from the north wind. Black smoke, thick and oily, the kind that came from burning wood and hay and the barn. Daniel wheeled his horse and drove his heels into its flanks, sending the animal plunging back the way they'd come. The horse fought the pace, stumbling in the deep snow, but Daniel pushed it mercilessly. His heart hammered against his ribs as the smoke grew thicker, darker, billowing now into the morning sky like a funeral shroud. He crested the ridge and saw his worst fear confirmed. His barn was an inferno. Flames roared through the old timber structure, shooting through the roof in towers of fire that turned the snow around it to slush. The heat was visible even from a distance, warping the air, and Daniel could hear the terrified screams of horses trapped inside. He didn't think. He dismounted at a run, leaving his horse ground-tied, and sprinted toward the burning building. The heat hit him like a wall when he was still 20 feet away, singeing his eyebrows, making his eyes water. Through the smoke and flame, he could see the barn doors, closed and barred from the outside. Someone had locked his horses in to die. Daniel grabbed a length of timber from the woodpile and used it to lever the bar free. The doors swung open and a wave of heat and smoke belched out, nearly knocking him backward. Inside, through the hell of burning hay and collapsing beams, he could see both horses rearing and screaming. He pulled his bandana over his face and plunged inside. The world became fire and noise. Burning hay fell from the loft in sheets of flame. Smoke filled his lungs, making him cough so hard his ribs ached. The horses were wild with terror, eyes rolling white, striking out with iron-shod hooves at anything that moved. Daniel caught the first horse's halter and dragged it toward the door. The animal fought him, too panicked to understand rescue, but Daniel held on with desperate strength and hauled it through the smoke toward the rectangle of gray daylight. The horse stumbled out into the snow and bolted, trailing sparks from its singed mane. Daniel went back for the second horse. A beam crashed down behind him, sending up a shower of sparks and burning debris. The smoke was so thick now he couldn't see more than a few feet. He found the second horse by sound, following its terrified screams, and got a hand on its halter just as another section of roof collapsed. He pulled the horse toward where he remembered the door being, choking on smoke, his eyes burning so badly he could barely see. Heat seared his back through his coat. Something fell and struck his shoulder, pain lancing through him. But he kept moving, kept dragging the horse forward. Then they were out, stumbling into the snow, Daniel falling to his knees while the horse galloped away to join its companion. He stayed down, gasping for air, coughing up black phlegm, his shoulders screaming. Behind him, the barn gave a great groan and collapsed in on itself, sending up a pillar of flame and sparks that must have been visible for miles. Daniel forced himself to his feet and staggered away from the heat, his mind already working through the disaster. The barn was gone. All his hay, all his tack, all his tools, gone. The horses had survived, but barely, and winter was just beginning. Without shelter for his animals, without feed stored up, he'd lose everything. That's when he saw it. A kerosene can, sitting in the snow 20 feet from the burning barn, too new to have been there before the fire, and stamped on its side in black paint were initials. D.C. Daniel Carter. His own kerosene can, the one he kept in the barn for the lanterns. Except he knew with absolute certainty that he'd left that can inside the barn, nearly full, sitting on the shelf by the tack room door. Someone had taken it out before setting the fire, had placed it where it would be found, had left evidence that would point directly at him. Daniel was still staring at the can when he heard the hoofbeats. Sheriff Porter arrived with 2 deputies and Silas Boone's foreman, a hard-eyed man named Garrett. They reined in their horses at the edge of the firelight, taking in the scene with expressions that ranged from false concern to barely concealed satisfaction. "Well now," Porter said, dismounting slowly. "That's a hell of a fire, Carter. What happened here?" "Someone burned my barn." Daniel's voice was raw from the smoke. "Locked my horses inside and set it alight." "That's so?" Porter walked over to the kerosene can, bent down to examine it without touching it. "Funny thing, we got a report about an hour ago. Anonymous tip saying they'd seen smoke coming from your property. Said it looked like you might be trying to burn down your own barn for the insurance money." The trap closed with the precision of a steel jaw. "That's a lie." "Is it?" Porter straightened. "Because here's what I see. I see a man who's been struggling financially. A man who just lost several head of cattle in the storm. A man who owes money to the bank. Money that's now owned by Mr. Boone." He gestured at the burning ruins. "And I see a barn that's been burned down, with that man's own kerosene can sitting right here in the snow. Looks to me like someone tried to make it look like an accident, but didn't quite pull it off. I was on my way to town when I saw the smoke. I came back and found it already burning. Got any witnesses to that?" "You know I don't." "Exactly." Porter pulled a pair of iron manacles from his belt. "Daniel Carter, I'm arresting you on suspicion of arson and insurance fraud. You have the right to—" "This is Boone's doing." Daniel took a step back, his hand moving toward his revolver. "He set this fire to frame me, just like he probably killed those 3 men 30 years ago and framed Margaret Doyle." The deputies drew their weapons. 3 guns trained on Daniel's chest. "Don't do something stupid," Porter said quietly. "You're already in enough trouble. Reaching for that gun will just add to it." Daniel looked at the guns pointed at him, at Porter's smug face, at the burning remains of his barn. He thought about Margaret sitting in a cell, about Boone's cold eyes and colder smile, about 30 years of murder hidden behind badges and banks, and the casual cruelty of small-town politics. He let his hand fall away from his revolver. Porter stepped forward and snapped the manacles around Daniel's wrists. The metal was cold even through his gloves, and the click of the lock sounded like the closing of a door he'd never be able to open again. "Your insurance policy is with Mountain States, isn't it?" Porter asked conversationally as he led Daniel toward the horses. "I believe that's one of Mr. Boone's companies. Funny how these things work out." They put Daniel on his horse with his hands bound in front of him. One of the deputies took the reins while another gathered up the kerosene can as evidence. As they rode away from the burning barn, Daniel looked back at his ranch one last time. The cabin still stood, small and alone in the snow. The cattle were scattered across the near pasture, confused and frightened, and the barn burned like a beacon, announcing to anyone who cared to look that Daniel Carter's resistance had been broken. Boone had won. The jail in Silver Creek occupied the back half of the sheriff's office, a stone building that had been built solid enough to hold men charged with everything from drunk and disorderly to murder. Daniel had never been inside before, never had reason to see the 3 cells that lined the back wall, their bars thick and rust-spotted. They put him in the middle cell. In the cell to his left sat Margaret Doyle. She looked up when they brought him in, her face going pale when she saw the manacles and the soot staining his clothes. "What happened?" she asked as soon as the deputies left them alone. "Someone burned my barn." Daniel sat on the narrow cot, exhausted and hurting. His shoulder where the burning debris had struck him throbbed with each heartbeat. "Then they arrested me for arson." Margaret's hands gripped the bars between their cells. Boone, who else? Daniel leaned his head back against the cold stone wall. He's been planning this since the day I refused his offer. Maybe longer. Everything that's happened, your arrest, the fire, the evidence, it's all been choreographed. I told you to let me go. I told you what he was. I know. Daniel managed a bitter smile. I just didn't realize how thorough he'd be about destroying anyone who got in his way. They sat in silence for a while, two prisoners in adjacent cells, listening to the sounds of the town beyond the walls. Footsteps on the boardwalk, conversations muffled by distance and stone, the rattle of a wagon passing, normal life continuing while theirs fell apart. They're going to try us together, Margaret said eventually, or maybe separately, but for crimes that support each other. You for arson and fraud, me for murder. By the time they're done, we'll both look guilty and Boone will have your land and his revenge on me for knowing too much. What evidence do they have against you? Does it matter? They can manufacture whatever they need. But she answered anyway. Porter says they've found arsenic in my old room, says he believes I poisoned all three men over time, made it look like natural causes or accidents. Never mind that I was barely 20 when Thomas died and didn't know the first thing about poisons. Never mind that the sheriff 30 years ago ruled everything accidental. None of that matters when you've got a badge and a jar of arsenic that was probably planted yesterday. Daniel stood and walked to the bars, testing them with his hands, even though he knew it was useless. The iron was solid, the locks heavy, and even if they somehow escaped the cells, there were deputies in the front office and the whole town beyond. There has to be a way out of this, he said. There isn't. Margaret's voice was flat, defeated. Boone owns the sheriff, probably owns the judge. He's got the money to buy witnesses and fabricate evidence. We're not fighting a criminal, Daniel. We're fighting the whole corrupt system that lets men like him do whatever they want. Then we find someone outside the system, the territorial marshal, the federal authorities, who are probably in Boone's pocket too, or will be by the time our case comes to trial. Margaret shook her head. I've had 30 years to think about this. 30 years to wonder if there was any way to prove what really happened to Thomas and James and Samuel. And I've come to understand something about power. Real power isn't just about having money or influence. It's about controlling the narrative. Boone's been telling his story for decades, the story of the cursed widow and the tragic accidents. He's told it so many times that everyone believes it, and now he's adding a new chapter about the crazy hermit who burned down his own barn. So we're just going to sit here and accept it? What choice do we have? Daniel didn't have an answer for that. He returned to his cot, trying to find a position that didn't aggravate his injured shoulder. Through the small window high in the wall, he could see the sky darkening toward evening. One day gone. How many more before the trial? Before Boone's carefully constructed lies became legal truth? The door to the cell block opened and Sheriff Porter walked in carrying 2 tin plates of food. He slid one through the slot in each cell door, the metal scraping against metal. "Stew and bread," he announced. "Eat up. Might be the best meal you get for a while." "When's the trial?" Daniel asked. "Judge Morrison's due in from Helena next week. Till then, you two get to enjoy our hospitality." Porter leaned against the wall, arms folded. "You know, Carter, this all could have been avoided. Mr. Boone made you a fair offer, more than fair, but you had to be stubborn about it. Fair would be leaving people alone when they say no. That's the problem with men like you. You think the world should work according to your rules, but it doesn't. It works according to the rules of men who have the power to make them." Porter pushed off from the wall. "Mr. Boone's got that power. You don't. The sooner you accept that, the easier this will be." "Easier for who?" "For everyone." Porter moved toward the door. "You could still make a deal, you know. Sign over the deed to your ranch, and maybe Mr. Boone could be persuaded to drop some of the charges. You might only do a year or 2 instead of 10. And Margaret?" Porter glanced at the old woman in the adjacent cell. "Mrs. Doyle's situation is different. She's been wanted for questioning for a long time. Can't really help her. Because she knows too much about what really happened 30 years ago." "I don't know what you're talking about." But Porter's eyes flickered, just for a second, and Daniel knew he'd struck close to the truth. After Porter left, they ate in silence. The stew was thin and greasy, the bread stale, but Daniel forced it down. He needed his strength, needed to keep his mind sharp. Because Margaret might have given up hope, but he hadn't. Not yet. Night fell. The oil lamp hanging in the corridor cast shadows through the bars, turning the cell block into a cage of light and darkness. Daniel lay on his cot, listening to Margaret's quiet breathing from the next cell, and thought about everything that had led to this moment. A handkerchief. A lie. A simple act of kindness that had set in motion a cascade of consequences he couldn't have predicted. He didn't regret it. Even now, sitting in a jail cell facing charges that could destroy his life, he didn't regret treating Margaret Doyle like a human being. Because that's what separated men like him from men like Silas Boone, the willingness to do the right thing even when it cost everything. But righteousness didn't break iron bars, and faith in justice didn't mean much when justice had been purchased by the highest bidder. Daniel was drifting toward sleep when he heard it. A soft tapping on the window high in the wall. So quiet he almost missed it. He sat up, listening. There it was again. Tap, tap, tap. Daniel stood on his cot and peered through the window. A face looked back at him from the darkness outside. Young, weathered, familiar in a way he couldn't quite place. The face gestured urgently for Daniel to step back, then disappeared. Moments later, something slid through the window bars. A rolled piece of paper tied with string. It fell onto Daniel's cot with a soft thump. Daniel grabbed it and unrolled it, moving close to the lamplight to read the cramped handwriting. Mr. Carter, my name is Thomas Wright, Samuel Wright's grandson. I know what happened to my grandfather, I know what Silas Boone did, and I know how to prove it. But I need your help. Tomorrow night, there will be a distraction in town. When it happens, be ready. Someone will come for you. Trust no one except the person who says the word covenant. Burn this letter. Daniel read the message 3 times, committing it to memory, then tore the paper into tiny pieces and scattered them in the slop bucket. Margaret had heard the movement. What was that? Hope, Daniel said quietly. Maybe. He told her about the message, about Thomas Wright and the promise of rescue. Margaret listened without interrupting, but when he finished, she shook her head. It's a trap. Boone trying to add escape attempt to your charges. Maybe. Or maybe Samuel Wright's grandson has been waiting 30 years to get revenge for his grandfather's murder. And maybe pigs will fly. But Margaret's voice held a note of something that might have been hope. Even if it's real, how's one man going to get us out of a locked jail? I don't know. But I'm not going to sit here and wait to be convicted of crimes I didn't commit. Daniel lay back down, his mind racing. Tomorrow night. That gives us 1 day to prepare. Prepare for what? For whatever comes next. The next day crawled past with agonizing slowness. Daniel exercised in his small cell, keeping his muscles loose, testing his injured shoulder. It hurt, but the pain was manageable. He'd have full range of motion when he needed it. Porter brought them lunch and dinner, both equally unappetizing. A few townspeople came by to stare at the prisoners like they were animals in a zoo. Daniel recognized most of them, shopkeepers and ranch hands, people he'd done business with over the years. They looked at him with curiosity and judgment and a kind of vindictive satisfaction. They'd convicted him already in their minds. The trial would just make it official. Night fell again. Daniel lay on his cot, every sense alert, waiting for the distraction Thomas Wright had promised. It came at midnight. The church bell began ringing frantically, shattering the night quiet. Daniel sat up, heard shouting from the street outside, running footsteps, someone yelling, "Fire! Fire!" Porter and his deputies rushed out of the office, leaving the jail unguarded. Through the window, Daniel could see the glow of flames somewhere to the north. Not huge, nothing like his barn, but enough to draw attention. "That's the distraction," Margaret whispered urgently. "But who's coming for us?" They didn't have to wait long. The door to the cell block opened and a figure slipped inside. Young, lean, moving with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Thomas Wright. He had the same sharp features Daniel had seen through the window, the same steady eyes. He held a ring of keys in one hand and a pistol in the other. "Are you Daniel Carter?" "I am." "Covenant," Thomas said. "My grandfather used that word in his last letter to me. Said it was the promise he made to your wife before she died, that he'd watch over you and Mrs. Doyle because someone needed to stand against Silas Boone." The key turned in the lock and Daniel's cell door swung open. Thomas moved immediately to Margaret's cell, working the lock with practiced ease. How did you get the keys? Daniel asked. Took them off the wall while Porter was running toward the fire. We've got maybe 10 minutes before someone realizes the jail's unguarded. Thomas pulled Margaret's cell door open. Can you ride? I can do whatever I need to do, Margaret said. They moved quickly through the empty office and out into the chaos of Silver Creek's main street. Half the town was running toward the fire. Someone's tool shed, Thomas explained, soaked in kerosene and set alight as a diversion. In the confusion, no one noticed three figures slipping into the alley behind the jail. Two horses waited there, saddled and ready. Thomas helped Margaret onto one while Daniel mounted the other. Where are we going? Daniel asked. Somewhere safe. Somewhere Boone can't reach you. Thomas swung up behind Margaret. I'll explain everything once we're clear of town. Right now we ride hard and don't look back. They rode out of Silver Creek at a gallop, heading east into the dark wilderness. Behind them, the church bell continued to ring, and people shouted and the fire burned. Daniel looked back once, saw the lights of the town receding into the distance, and realized there was no turning back now. They were fugitives, criminals in the eyes of the law, even if they were innocent. But they were free, and freedom, even temporary freedom, was worth any price. They rode for hours, following trails that Thomas seemed to know by instinct. The moon was high and bright, turning the snow-covered landscape into a world of silver and shadow. Finally, as dawn began to gray the eastern sky, Thomas led them to a small cabin tucked into a fold in the hills. This was my grandfather's hunting camp, he said as they dismounted. Nobody knows about it except family. We'll be safe here for a few days. Inside, the cabin was simple but solid. One room with a fireplace, some bunks, supplies stored in barrels. Thomas got a fire going while Margaret collapsed onto one of the bunks, exhausted from the ride. Daniel stood by the fire, warming his hands, studying the young man who'd risked everything to break them out of jail. Why? He asked. Why help us? Thomas pulled a battered leather journal from his coat and handed it to Daniel. This was my grandfather's. He kept it hidden, knew it was too dangerous to show anyone while Boone was alive. But after he died, my father found it and read it. Then he gave it to me before he passed. Daniel opened the journal, page after page of careful handwriting, dates and observations and names. He saw Thomas Doyle mentioned, James Doyle. References to land deals and intimidation and suspicious deaths. My grandfather was investigating Boone, Thomas said, had been for years. He knew about the railroad before anyone else did, knew Boone was using that information to buy up land cheap or force people to sell, and he knew that anyone who refused ended up dead. He told me he was going to the marshal, Margaret said from the bunk, the night before he died. He was. Thomas pointed to an entry near the end of the journal. He'd gathered enough evidence to bring charges, had witnesses willing to testify, documents proving Boone's corruption. He was going to ride to Helena the next morning. But he died in his sleep, Daniel said. Poisoned. Thomas's voice was hard. The doctor who examined him was in Boone's pocket. Ruled it natural causes. But my grandfather knew it was coming. He wrote it in his final entry, said if he died suddenly, it was murder, and Boone was responsible. Daniel read the final page. Samuel Wright's handwriting, shaky but clear. If you're reading this, I'm likely dead. Know that I did not die naturally. Know that Silas Boone ordered my death to silence me, just as he ordered the deaths of Thomas Doyle and James Doyle before me. The evidence is hidden where only family can find it. Use it wisely. Use it to bring him to justice. And remember the covenant I made, to protect those who cannot protect themselves, to stand against corruption even when it costs everything. The entry was dated the night before Samuel Wright died. Daniel closed the journal carefully. This is proof. This could bring Boone down. It's evidence of motive and intent, Thomas corrected. But it's not enough for a conviction. My grandfather's testimony died with him. The witnesses he'd gathered either recanted or disappeared. All we have is an old man's suspicions written in a journal. Then what good is it? By itself? Not much. Thomas smiled grimly. But combined with what I've been gathering for the past 5 years, it might be enough. He pulled out another bundle of papers from his saddlebag. Daniel recognized legal documents, land deeds, bank records. Thomas spread them on the rough table. I've been following my grandfather's footsteps, he said. tracking Boone's land deals, documenting the pattern. Every time someone stood in his way, they either sold suddenly or died. And every time they died, the land ended up in Boone's hands within months. He pointed to the papers. I've got 8 suspicious deaths spanning 30 years. All of them refused to sell to Boone. All of them died under questionable circumstances. And all of their property eventually became part of the Broken Star Empire. Margaret sat up, staring at the documents. 8? I only knew about 3. There were more. Many more. My grandfather suspected at least a dozen, but he could only prove 8. Thomas looked at them both. Silas Boone has built his fortune on murder, and he's gotten away with it because he owns the local law and most people are too afraid to speak against him. So what do we do? Daniel asked. We go over Porter's head, over the territorial authorities' heads. Thomas pulled out one final document, an official-looking letter with a federal seal. My grandfather had friends in Washington. One of them is now a federal judge. I've been corresponding with him for 2 years building our case. He's agreed to send federal marshals to investigate, but he needs witnesses willing to testify. We'll testify, Margaret said immediately. You're fugitives now, escaped prisoners. Your testimony will be questioned. Thomas looked apologetic. We need more. We need someone on the inside, someone close to Boone who's willing to turn against him. Daniel thought about that, about Boone's operation, the people who worked for him, the men who'd helped him build his empire on blood and fear. How do we find someone like that? We don't find them, Thomas said. We create them. Over the next several hours, as the sun climbed and filled the cabin with pale winter light, Thomas laid out his plan. It was dangerous and complex and required timing that bordered on miraculous. But it was also the only chance they had. They would need to get back into Silver Creek without being caught. They would need to find one of Boone's men who might be vulnerable to persuasion. And they would need to do it all before Boone realized they'd escaped and tightened his grip even further. There's one man who might help us, Daniel said slowly. Cole, one of Boone's ranch hands. I've known him for years. He's hard, but he's not evil. And I know for a fact that Boone still owes him 6 months' back wages. Money might not be enough, Thomas warned. It's not about money. It's about respect. Daniel remembered conversations at the general store, complaints Cole had made about Boone's treatment of his workers. Cole's proud. Boone's been treating him like property, and he's getting tired of it. If we can offer him a way out, a chance to start over somewhere Boone can't reach him, he might be willing to talk. And if he refuses, then we find someone else. Or we try something else. But we have to try. Margaret stood and walked to the window, looking out at the wilderness. This is madness. We're 3 people against the most powerful man in the territory. Even if we get Cole to talk, even if federal marshals come, Boone will fight. He'll use every resource he has to destroy us. Then we make sure the evidence is so overwhelming he can't fight it, Thomas said. My grandfather believed that truth had power, that even the strongest corruption couldn't stand against it forever. I want to believe that too. Daniel joined Margaret at the window. Out there in the snow and silence was his ranch, his land, everything he'd built with Rebecca. Boone had taken it all from him with lies and manufactured evidence, had destroyed Margaret's life 30 years ago, and was now trying to finish the job. But they weren't helpless victims anymore. They had allies, they had evidence, and they had nothing left to lose. When do we start? Daniel asked. Thomas smiled. Tonight, as soon as it's dark enough to move without being seen. They spent the rest of the day preparing. Thomas had supplies cached at the cabin. Extra ammunition, warm clothing, food for several days. Daniel cleaned his rifle and checked his revolver, making sure both were in working order. Margaret sharpened a hunting knife she'd found among the supplies, her face set with determination. As twilight fell, they gathered around the fire one last time. If this goes wrong, Margaret said quietly, if we get caught or killed, I want you both to know something. I've spent 30 years feeling like a curse, like everything I touched turned to ash. But these past few days, standing beside people who believe in something beyond fear and greed, I've remembered what it feels like to be human. She looked at each of them. Whatever happens, thank you for that. We're not going to die, Thomas said firmly. We're going to win. And when we do, Silas Boone is going to learn that some people can't be bought or intimidated or destroyed. Daniel stood and walked to the door, looking out at the gathering darkness. Somewhere out there, Boone was probably organizing search parties, putting pressure on his contacts in the territorial government, preparing to crush this rebellion before it could spread. But Boone had made a mistake. He'd underestimated what desperate people could accomplish when they had nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. The war was just beginning, and Daniel intended to make sure it ended with justice, not with more graves. They rode out as the stars emerged, three shadows moving through a landscape of silver and black, heading toward a confrontation that would either destroy them or set them free. The Broken Star Ranch spread across the valley like a kingdom, 40,000 acres of prime land that represented everything Silas Boone had built through 3 decades of calculated ruthlessness. The main house sat on a rise overlooking the holdings, a 2-story structure of imported timber and stone that spoke of wealth without taste, power without grace. Daniel, Margaret, and Thomas watched it from the cover of a pine grove 2 miles distant, studying the layout through Thomas's field glasses as midnight approached. "Coal bunks in the workers' quarters," Daniel said, pointing to a long, low building behind the main barn. "Third window from the left. He's a light sleeper and keeps a gun under his pillow, so we'll need to wake him carefully." "How do you know which window?" Thomas asked. "I worked here for a season before I bought my own land. Cole and I shared that room." Daniel lowered the glasses. "The question is how we get to him without alerting the whole ranch." "I can handle that," Margaret said quietly. Both men turned to look at her. She pulled her threadbare shawl tighter against the cold. "An old woman wandering lost in the snow. They'll either ignore me or feel sorry for me. Either way, I can get close without raising suspicion." "Too dangerous," Daniel said immediately. "Everything we're doing is dangerous." Margaret's voice was steel-wrapped in calm. "But I'm the only one who can walk up to that bunkhouse without being shot on sight. You're both wanted fugitives. I'm just a confused old woman who escaped from jail and doesn't know where she is." Thomas studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "She's right, but we'll need to be in position to help if things go wrong." They worked out the details quickly. Margaret would approach from the south, looking disoriented and harmless. Daniel and Thomas would circle around to the north, staying in the shadows of the outbuildings, ready to intervene if needed. Once Margaret had Cole's attention, she'd convince him to slip out and meet them at the equipment shed where they could talk privately. It was a thin plan, full of ways it could fail. But thin was all they had. Margaret set off alone, her footsteps leaving a trail through the fresh snow. Daniel watched her go, this woman who'd survived 30 years of exile and was now walking straight into the camp of the man who'd destroyed her life. "She's braver than both of us combined," Thomas murmured. "She's had more practice at being afraid," Daniel replied. "Eventually you get so used to it, it stops controlling you." They moved through the darkness, skirting the main buildings, using every shadow and blind spot Daniel remembered from his time working here. The ranch was quiet at this hour, most of the hands asleep. Only one man on night watch, and he was stationed near the main house, not the workers' quarters. From their position behind the equipment shed, they watched Margaret approach the bunkhouse. She stumbled convincingly, caught herself on the wall, then knocked on the door. Nothing happened for a long moment. Then the door opened a crack and lamplight spilled out. A man's voice, rough with sleep, asked something Daniel couldn't hear. Margaret spoke, her words carrying across the cold air. "Please, I'm lost. I don't know where I am. Can you help me?" The door opened wider. Cole stood there in his long underwear, holding a lamp, squinting at the old woman on his doorstep. Even from this distance, Daniel could see the confusion on his face. "Mrs. Doyle, what in hell are you doing out here?" "I escaped," Margaret said, her voice trembling. "From the jail. I didn't know where else to go. I thought maybe someone here might have mercy." Cole looked past her into the darkness, clearly suspicious. "You escaped and came straight to Boone's ranch? That don't make sense." Nothing makes sense anymore." Margaret swayed, and it wasn't entirely acting. She was exhausted from the long ride, from days of stress and fear. "Please, I just need somewhere warm, just for a few minutes." Cole hesitated, torn between suspicion and the ingrained habit of helping someone in need. Finally, he stepped back. "All right, but just until I can figure out what to do with you. Come on." Margaret disappeared inside. The door closed. Daniel felt his chest tighten. If Cole decided to alert Boone, they'd have minutes at best before armed men came flooding out of the main house. 10 minutes passed. 15. Daniel was about to suggest they abort when the bunkhouse door opened again. Cole emerged, fully dressed now, a coat over his shoulders. He looked around carefully, then started walking toward the equipment shed. Toward them. Margaret had done it. Cole entered the shed and stopped short when he saw Daniel and Thomas waiting in the shadows. His hand went to the gun at his hip. "Easy," Daniel said, showing his empty hands. "We just want to talk." "Carter?" Cole's eyes adjusted to the darkness. "You're supposed to be in jail. So is Mrs. Doyle, but here we are. We need your help, Cole." "Help?" Cole's laugh was bitter. "You're fugitives. I help you, I lose my job. Maybe worse." "You're going to lose your job anyway," Thomas said. "Boone's planning to sell this ranch to the Railroad Consortium next spring. Every hand will be let go. He's already negotiating the deal." Cole's expression flickered. "How do you know that?" "Because I've been tracking his business dealings for 5 years. Thomas stepped forward. "Silas Boone doesn't care about this ranch, or the people who work it. It's just another asset to be liquidated when the price is right. He owes you 6 months' wages. You think he's going to pay that before he sells out and disappears? He promised." "He lies!" Daniel's voice was hard. "That's what he does. He lies and cheats and kills anyone who gets in his way. We can prove it, but we need your help." Cole stood silent, his jaw working. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft flakes drifting past the open shed door. "What kind of help?" he asked finally. "We need you to testify about what you've seen working for Boone. The intimidation, the threats, the suspicious accidents. You've been here 8 years, Cole. You've seen things that didn't add up. Tell us about them." "And then what? Boone finds out I talked and I end up like Thomas Doyle, like Samuel Wright?" Cole shook his head. "I'm not brave enough to die for your cause, Carter." "You won't have to die." Thomas pulled out the letter with the federal seal. "We've got federal marshals coming, real law, not the corrupt local version. You testify, you'll be under federal protection. Boone won't be able to touch you." "Federal protection?" Cole laughed again, but this time it sounded hollow. "You really believe that?" "I believe it more than I believe Silas Boone's promises," Daniel said. "And I believe you're a better man than to keep working for someone who treats you like disposable property." The words hit home. Daniel could see it in the way Cole's shoulders tightened, in the flash of anger that crossed his face. "All right," Cole said quietly. "What do you want to know?" They talked for 2 hours in that cold shed, Cole's testimony painting a picture of systematic violence and corruption that went even deeper than Thomas's research had revealed. He spoke of cattle rustled from neighboring ranches and rebranded with the broken star mark, of men beaten for refusing to sell their land, of a fire 7 years ago that had killed a family of homesteaders who'd filed a water rights complaint against Boone. "Sheriff ruled it accidental," Cole said the father must have knocked over a lamp. "But I was there the next morning, saw the kerosene marks around the outside of the cabin. Someone had doused it and lit it while they were sleeping." "Did you tell anyone?" Margaret asked. "Who was I going to tell? Porter? He's the one who ruled it accidental in the first place." Cole's face was haggard in the lamplight. "I told myself it wasn't my problem. Told myself I was just doing a job. But I knew. We all knew. And we did nothing." "You're doing something now," Daniel said. "Maybe too late." "It's never too late for the truth." Cole looked at him with eyes that had seen too much and believed too little. "You're an optimist, Carter. I hope you're right. But I've been around men like Boone long enough to know that truth doesn't mean much when power decides what's real." They were preparing to leave when they heard it, the sound of many horses coming fast from the direction of Silver Creek. Cole moved to the shed door and peered out. "Riders," he said urgently. "At least a dozen. Heading for the main house." Daniel joined him at the door. In the pre-dawn gray, he could see the mounted men approaching, could make out Silas Boone's distinctive figure leading them. Behind Boone rode Sheriff Porter and what looked like every able-bodied man from town. "They're organizing a manhunt," Thomas said, "looking for us. Then we need to leave, now." Daniel turned to Cole. "Come with us. You've already committed. If Boone finds out you talk to us, you're a dead man anyway." Cole hesitated only a moment before nodding. "I got a horse in the barn. Give me 2 minutes." He slipped out into the growing light, moving quickly toward the barn. Daniel, Margaret, and Thomas waited in tense silence, watching the riders gather at the main house. Boone was gesturing, giving orders, organizing his men into search parties. Cole reappeared leading a saddled horse. "We go northeast through the canyon. It's rough territory, but we can lose them there." They mounted quickly, 4 riders now instead of 3, and took off at a controlled pace that wouldn't attract immediate attention. Once they were clear of the ranch buildings, they urged their horses into a gallop. Behind them, someone shouted. The alarm had been raised. They rode hard through the dawn, the horses' breath steaming in the cold air, hoofbeats pounding against frozen ground. The canyon Cole had mentioned opened before them, a narrow slash between rock walls that rose 50 feet on either side. It was treacherous terrain, full of loose rock and hidden ice, but it was also impossible to navigate quickly with a large group. The pursuing riders would have to slow down or risk breaking their horses' legs. They plunged into the canyon, single file, the horses picking their way carefully over the broken ground. Behind them, Daniel could hear the manhunt reaching the canyon mouth, could hear Boone's voice raised in fury. "Split up," Boone was shouting. 5 men through the canyon, the rest around to cut them off on the other side." The canyon twisted and turned, each bend hiding them briefly from pursuit before exposing them again. Twice, Daniel's horse stumbled on hidden ice and nearly went down. Margaret's horse was laboring, the old animal not built for this kind of sustained flight. They burst out of the canyon's far end into open country just as the sun broke over the eastern mountains, flooding the world with harsh light that eliminated all shadows, all hiding places. And there, waiting for them, were the riders who'd gone around. 5 men spread in a line, rifles drawn, blocking their escape. Daniel pulled up hard, his horse sliding to a stop. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew louder. They were trapped, caught between 2 groups with nowhere to run. Boone emerged from the canyon at the head of his men, his face red with cold and rage. He rode forward until he was 20 feet from Daniel, his rifle resting across his saddle. "End of the line, Carter," Boone said. "You've led me on a hell of a chase, but it's over now." "It's not over until you're in chains," Daniel replied. "In chains?" Boone laughed. "You're a fugitive, an escaped prisoner. You've got no credibility, no evidence, and no way out." He gestured at Cole. "And you? I should have known you didn't have the loyalty to stick, but stealing one of my horses? That's a hanging offense." "I didn't steal anything," Cole said. "This horse is mine, bought with wages you never paid. You'll hang anyway." Boone raised his rifle slightly. "All of you will. Resisting arrest, killed trying to escape. However I want to write it up. Nobody's going to question my version." "The federal marshals will," Thomas said. Boone's eyes narrowed. "What marshals?" "The ones who will be in Silver Creek by the end of the week. The ones coming to investigate 8 suspicious deaths spanning 30 years. The ones who have jurisdiction over territorial corruption and don't answer to you or your bought politicians." Thomas pulled out the letter again. "You're done, Boone. Your empire's about to come crashing down." For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Boone's face. He looked at the letter, at Thomas's confident expression, and Daniel could see him calculating odds and consequences. "You're bluffing," Boone said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Am I? Want to risk it? Because if you kill us now, those marshals will know exactly who did it. You'll be hunted by the federal government. No amount of money or influence will save you then." The standoff stretched, tension singing in the cold air. Boone's men shifted nervously, fingers on triggers waiting for orders. Behind Daniel, he could feel Margaret trembling, whether from cold or fear he couldn't tell. Then, incredibly, Cole spoke up. "He's right, Mr. Boone. I'll testify too. About everything I've seen, the beatings, the threats, the homesteaders who burned to death." His voice grew stronger. "I stayed quiet for 8 years because I was afraid. But I'm done being afraid of you." "You're signing your death warrant," Boone said softly. "Maybe, but at least I'll die standing up instead of on my knees." One of Boone's men, Travis, Daniel recognized, shifted in his saddle. "Boss, if there really are federal marshals coming, maybe we should—" "Shut up," Boone snapped. But the damage was done. Doubt had entered his ranks, and doubt was contagious. Boone stared at them for a long moment, his rifle still raised, clearly wrestling with the decision to kill them all and take his chances or let them go and try to fight the legal battle ahead. Finally, he lowered his rifle. "You've got nothing," he said. "No proof that'll stand up in any court. Just the ravings of an old woman everyone knows is cursed, a hermit who burned his own barn, and a kid with delusions of justice." He smiled, but it was a cold, reptilian expression. "Go ahead. Talk to your federal marshals. I'll bury them in lawyers and witnesses who'll swear to whatever version of events serves my interests. And when it's all over, I'll still own this valley, and you'll all be in prison or dead." He wheeled his horse around and rode back toward the canyon without another word. His men followed, some of them glancing back nervously, but none brave enough to defy him openly. Daniel didn't move until the last rider had disappeared into the canyon. Only then did he let out the breath he'd been holding. "That was too close," Margaret said, her voice shaking. "He's not done," Thomas warned. "He'll regroup, get his lawyers involved, start building his defense. And he was right about one thing. We need more than testimony. We need physical evidence that ties him directly to the murders." "Where are we going to find that after 30 years?" Cole asked. Daniel thought about Samuel Wright's journal, about the old man's final words. "The evidence is hidden where only family can find it." "Your grandfather," he said to Thomas. "He said the evidence was hidden. Did he leave any clues about where?" Thomas pulled out the journal and flipped through the pages. "I've read this 100 times. There's nothing specific. Just that one line about family being able to find it." "Think like a man who knows he's going to be murdered," Margaret said. "Where would you hide something you wanted to keep safe but available to people you trusted?" They stood in a circle, 4 exhausted people with horses blowing hard trying to solve a puzzle that was 3 decades old. "His house," Cole said suddenly. "Samuel Wright's old house. It's still standing, been abandoned for years. If he hid evidence anywhere, it'd be there." "Boone probably searched it thoroughly after Samuel died," Thomas objected. "But Boone didn't know Samuel the way family did." Daniel felt something clicking into place. "He said only family could find it." "What was special about your grandfather, Thomas? What did he love that was uniquely his?" Thomas thought for a moment, then his eyes widened. "Books. He loved books. Had a collection of first editions, kept them in a special cabinet he'd built himself. Said they were the only wealth that mattered." "Did Boone take them?" "No. My father inherited them, gave them to me before he died. I've still got them, in storage in Helena." "Then that's where we look," Margaret said with certainty. "Hidden in the books. Something coded or concealed that only someone who knew Samuel would think to check." It was thin, but it was all they had, and the clock was ticking. Boone would be gathering his resources, calling in favors, building his defense. Every hour they delayed gave him more time to shore up his position. "How fast can you get to Helena?" Daniel asked Thomas. 2 days hard riding, 3 if the weather turns. Then we split up. You and Cole go to Helena, find those books, search them for whatever evidence your grandfather hid. Margaret and I will go to the federal courthouse, file our testimony, make sure the investigation starts even if we can't provide immediate proof. "That's 40 miles through territory where Boone has eyes everywhere," Margaret protested. "Which is why we don't go directly. We circle west, come at it from the other direction. It'll take longer, but it's safer." Daniel looked at each of them. "This is our last chance. If we fail now, Boone wins. He keeps his empire. We go to prison, or worse, and 30 years of murder stays buried." "Then we don't fail," Thomas said simply. They shook hands there in the cold morning light, 4 people who'd been strangers a week ago now bound together by shared danger and desperate hope. Then they split up, Thomas and Cole heading northeast toward Helena, while Daniel and Margaret turned west toward the long route to the federal courthouse. The ride was brutal. Daniel pushed hard through the first day, knowing that Boone would have men searching for them. They avoided all settlements, all roads, sticking to wilderness trails that were barely paths. Margaret bore it without complaint, though Daniel could see the exhaustion in every line of her body. They made camp that night in a cave, huddled around a small fire that they kept hidden from view. Daniel heated beans and coffee, while Margaret sat wrapped in blankets staring into the flames. "Do you think we'll make it?" she asked quietly. "I have to believe we will." "That's not an answer." Daniel poured coffee, handed her a cup. "No, it's not. But it's all I've got. Faith that doing the right thing eventually leads to the right outcome, even when every piece of evidence suggests otherwise." Margaret sipped the coffee, winced at its bitterness. "Your wife was lucky to have you." "I was the lucky one." You still love her, after 6 years. The heart doesn't have a statute of limitations. Daniel stared into the fire. I used to think the loneliness would kill me. Used to sit in that cabin and wonder why I kept going when everything that mattered was gone. But these past few days, I've remembered something. What's that? That love isn't just about the person you lost. It's about honoring what they believed in. Rebecca believed in kindness, in standing up for people who couldn't stand up for themselves, in making the world a little less cruel. He looked at Margaret. Helping you, fighting Boone, trying to bring justice to people who died decades ago. This is how I keep loving her, by living the way she would have wanted me to live. Margaret's eyes were wet in the firelight. She would be proud of you. I hope so. They sat in silence after that, two damaged souls drawing what comfort they could from fire and coffee and the knowledge that they weren't alone anymore. The second day was harder. A storm moved in from the west, bringing snow and wind that cut visibility to almost nothing. They pushed on anyway, Daniel navigating by instinct and memory, hoping he was heading in the right direction. By nightfall, they could see the lights of the town where the federal courthouse stood. They'd made it. But as they approached, Daniel saw something that made his blood run cold. Horses tied outside the courthouse, at least a dozen of them. And standing on the courthouse steps, as if he'd been waiting for them, was Silas Boone. He wasn't alone. The sheriff was there and several of Boone's men, and Daniel's heart sank, a man in an expensive suit who could only be a lawyer. Maybe several lawyers. Boone had beaten them here, had anticipated their move and arrived first. What do we do? Margaret whispered. Daniel sat on his horse, thinking fast. They could run, but they were exhausted, and their horses were nearly spent. They could fight, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. Or they could ride forward and face whatever Boone had planned. We finish this, Daniel said. One way or another, we finish it tonight. He urged his horse forward, Margaret beside him, riding toward the courthouse and the confrontation that would determine everything. Boone watched them approach with that cold smile. Carter, he called out when they were close enough. Right on time. I've been waiting for you. I'm sure you have. Daniel dismounted, helped Margaret down. Planning to arrest us again on false charges? False? Boone gestured to the lawyers. I've got 3 attorneys here who'll testify that everything I've done is completely legal. And I've got a federal judge inside who's been a friend of mine for 20 years. You think you're going to waltz in there and make accusations against me? You're delusional. We have evidence, Daniel said. You have nothing. I made sure of that 30 years ago. Boone's smile widened. Samuel Wright's evidence? I burned it the night after I had him poisoned. His witnesses? All recanted or disappeared. You're chasing ghosts, Carter, and ghosts don't win legal battles. Margaret spoke up, her voice carrying across the cold air. You're wrong about one thing, Silas. Samuel did have family, and family remembers. The grandson? Please, Boone waved dismissively. That boy's been writing letters to federal judges for years. Nobody takes him seriously. They will now, a new voice said. Everyone turned. Thomas Wright stood at the corner of the courthouse, and beside him was Cole. And between them, carrying a wooden crate, was a man Daniel didn't recognize, elderly, distinguished, wearing the robes of a federal judge. Judge Blackwood, Boone said, his smile faltering. What are you doing here? My job, the judge replied. He set down the crate and pulled out a leather-bound book. Mr. Wright brought me some very interesting evidence this afternoon. Evidence his grandfather concealed in first edition books, knowing that Samuel's love of literature would lead his family to search there eventually. He opened the book. Tucked inside the pages were photographs, documents, signed confessions. This is testimony from 3 different men admitting they were paid by you to kill Thomas Doyle, James Doyle, and Samuel Wright himself. This is financial records showing payments to those men from your accounts. And this, he held up a photograph, is a picture of you meeting with one of the killers the day before Samuel Wright died. Boone's face had gone white. Those are forgeries. Fabrications. They've been authenticated by a handwriting expert and a federal forensics team that arrived in Helena yesterday. Judge Blackwood closed the book. Silas Boone, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, bribery of public officials, and fraud. Federal marshals? 4 men stepped out from inside the courthouse. their badges glinting in the lamplight. Boone's hand went to his gun, but he was surrounded. His own men backed away, suddenly unwilling to die for a lost cause. The lawyers began gathering their papers, already preparing their defenses. The sheriff tried to speak up. "Judge, I don't think you understand the situation here. Sheriff Porter, you're under arrest as well. Accessory to murder and corruption of office." Blackwood nodded to the marshals. "Take them both." It happened quickly after that. Boone was disarmed and handcuffed, his protests echoing off the courthouse walls. Porter went quietly, his face gray with shock. The lawyers scattered. Daniel stood with Margaret and watched justice finally arrive after 30 years of waiting. Thomas walked over to them, exhausted but triumphant. My grandfather's evidence was hidden in the end papers of his books, photographs glued under the leather bindings, documents sewn into the spines. He left a whole archive, everything he'd gathered, enough to put Boone away for life. "How did you find it so fast?" Daniel asked. "I didn't. Cole did." Thomas gestured to the ranch hand. "Turns out he knows books. His mother was a teacher. He recognized the signs of tampering, helped me search through 50 volumes in 6 hours." Cole shrugged, embarrassed. "Just did what needed doing." Judge Blackwood approached them. "You're all going to need to give testimony. This is going to be a long trial, and Boone's lawyers will fight every step. But with the evidence we have, conviction is certain." He looked at Margaret. "Mrs. Doyle, I owe you an apology on behalf of the territorial justice system. You've suffered for 30 years because we failed to investigate properly. That wrong can never be fully righted, but I promise you that Silas Boone will answer for every crime he's committed." Margaret could only nod, tears streaming down her face. They stood together on the courthouse steps as snow began to fall again, watching the marshals load Boone and Porter into a prison wagon. The fight wasn't over. There would be trials and testimony and probably more attempts by Boone to buy his way out. But the tide had turned. Truth had won. At least for tonight. The trial began 3 weeks later in a courtroom packed with spectators who'd come from every corner of the territory to witness the fall of Silas Boone. Daniel sat in the front row beside Margaret, watching as the man who'd terrorized the valley for 3 decades was led in wearing chains, his expensive suit rumpled, his face haggard from weeks in a federal holding cell. Boone's lawyers filled 2 entire tables, a small army of legal minds determined to find some crack in the prosecution's case. But Judge Blackwood ran his courtroom with iron discipline, cutting through objections and procedural delays with the efficiency of a man who'd seen every trick in the book. The evidence Thomas had discovered was devastating. Photograph after photograph showing Boone meeting with known criminals. Financial records documenting payments that coincided exactly with the deaths of Thomas Doyle, James Doyle, and Samuel Wright. And most damning of all, a signed confession from one of the killers, a man named Dutch Keller, who'd been dying of consumption when Samuel Wright found him and convinced him to tell the truth. "I was paid $500 to make Thomas Doyle's death look like an accident," the confession read, entered into evidence on the 3rd day of trial. "Mr. Boone came to me personally, said there was a rancher who needed convincing to sell his land. When I asked what kind of convincing, he handed me the money and said whatever it takes. I rigged Doyle's rifle to discharge when he pulled the bolt back. Boone gave me another $500 when the job was done." The courtroom had gone silent as the prosecutor read those words aloud. Even Boone's lawyers had looked shaken, but they fought anyway. They questioned the authenticity of the documents, suggested that Samuel Wright had fabricated evidence to pursue a personal vendetta, implied that Margaret had manipulated everything because of her own twisted desire for revenge. They called character witnesses who testified to Boone's generosity and civic contributions. They painted him as a pillar of the community being destroyed by jealous rivals and mentally unstable accusers. Daniel was called to testify on the 5th day. He walked to the witness stand aware of every eye in the courtroom following him, aware that Boone was watching him with barely concealed hatred. The prosecutor was a sharp woman named Elizabeth Hayes who'd been sent from Washington specifically to handle this case. She led Daniel through his testimony with methodical precision. The offers Boone had made to buy his ranch, the escalating threats, the barn fire, and the planted evidence. "Mr. Carter," she said, "in your opinion, what was Mr. Boone's objective in attempting to acquire your property?" "The railroad," Daniel replied. "My land sits directly in the path of the proposed rail line from Denver to Helena. Boone knew about the route before it was publicly announced. He was buying up properties along the path to resell to the railroad at massive profit. And when you refused to sell, he tried to force me, first with intimidation, then with manufactured legal troubles, and finally by framing me for arson. Boone's lead attorney, a silver-haired man named Caldwell, cross-examined him aggressively. Mr. Carter, isn't it true that you were isolated and grieving after the death of your wife? That you lived alone for 6 years, barely interacting with the community? That's true. And isn't it possible that in your isolation, you developed a skewed perception of Mr. Boone's business dealings? That you saw conspiracy where there was only legitimate commerce? No, Daniel said firmly. What I saw was a pattern of people who refused to sell to Boone ending up dead or destroyed. That's not paranoia. That's observation. You have no direct evidence that Mr. Boone committed any crimes against you personally, do you? No witnesses to him setting your barn on fire? The evidence speaks for itself. My kerosene can, placed where it would be found. The anonymous tip called in before I even discovered the fire. The sheriff arriving with arrest warrants already prepared. Daniel leaned forward. Boone orchestrated everything, and he would have gotten away with it if Samuel Wright hadn't been smart enough to hide evidence where it would eventually be found. Margaret testified on the 6th day. She took the stand with quiet dignity, her hands folded in her lap, and told the story of 30 years in exile. Told it without melodrama or self-pity, just the simple facts of what it was like to be called cursed, to be blamed for deaths she hadn't caused, to watch 3 good men die and know that no one would believe her suspicions about why. I thought for years that I really was cursed, she said, her voice steady. I thought maybe there was something wrong with me, something that brought death to people who cared about me. It wasn't until Samuel Wright started investigating that I understood the truth, that I'd been used, that Silas Boone had killed the men I loved and then turned the town's fear and superstition into a weapon against me. He made me his scapegoat, and it worked perfectly for 30 years. Caldwell tried to break her on cross-examination, suggesting she was an unreliable witness with a grudge against Boone, but Margaret had survived 3 decades of cruelty. A lawyer's questions couldn't shake her. Mr. Caldwell, she said at one point, you can try to make me look crazy or vengeful all you want. But the facts don't lie. 3 men died. All 3 had refused to sell land to your client, and all 3 deaths were ruled accidents by a sheriff who was on Boone's payroll. You can explain that away however you like, but the jury isn't stupid. They can see the pattern as clearly as I can. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Judge Blackwood had to use his gavel to restore order. Thomas Wright testified about his grandfather's investigation, about the years he'd spent following the same trail Samuel had walked, documenting the same patterns of corruption and violence. Cole testified about what he'd witnessed working for Boone, the intimidation tactics, the late-night meetings with dangerous men, the jobs that required muscle more than ranch skills. The prosecution called a parade of other witnesses, people who'd been threatened by Boone, families who'd lost land after refusing to sell, a former employee of the bank who testified that Boone had used his position to manipulate mortgages and force foreclosures. Even one of Boone's own lawyers, granted immunity in exchange for testimony, admitted that he'd helped Boone fabricate legal documents to support fraudulent land claims. The defense fought hard, but the weight of evidence was crushing. By the end of the 2nd week, even Caldwell's aggressive cross-examinations were starting to feel desperate. The trial lasted 17 days. On the morning of the 18th day, both sides gave their closing arguments. Elizabeth Hayes stood before the jury and laid out the case with devastating clarity. This is not a complicated story, she said. It's a simple story about greed and murder. Silas Boone wanted land. When people wouldn't sell, he had them killed. And when witnesses started asking questions, he killed them too. He used his wealth and influence to corrupt the local justice system, to turn public opinion against innocent people like Margaret Doyle, and to build an empire on blood. The evidence is overwhelming. The pattern is clear, and justice demands that you find him guilty on all counts. Caldwell countered with a speech about reasonable doubt and unreliable witnesses and the dangers of convicting a respected businessman based on decades-old documents that could have been forged. But his heart wasn't in it. Even he could see which way the wind was blowing. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned, the foreman stood and read the verdict in a voice that echoed through the silent courtroom. On the charge of conspiracy to commit murder in the death of Thomas Doyle, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of conspiracy to commit murder in the death of James Doyle, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of conspiracy to commit murder in the death of Samuel Wright, we find the defendant guilty. The litany continued. Guilty on charges of bribery, guilty on charges of fraud, guilty on charges of corruption of public officials, guilty on all 23 counts. Boone stood motionless as the verdict was read, his face a mask of disbelief. This wasn't supposed to happen. Men like him didn't lose. Men like him controlled the outcomes, but the evidence had been too strong, the truth too clear. And for once, justice had refused to be bought. Judge Blackwood set sentencing for the following week. In the meantime, Boone would remain in federal custody without possibility of bail. As the marshals led him away, Boone looked directly at Daniel. His eyes held pure hatred, but also something else. The shocked recognition that he'd finally met someone he couldn't intimidate or destroy. Daniel held his gaze until Boone was gone. Outside the courthouse, the winter sun was bright enough to hurt. Daniel stood on the steps with Margaret, Thomas, and Cole, feeling a weight lift that he hadn't even realized he'd been carrying. "It's over," Margaret said, almost to herself. "After 30 years, it's finally over." "Not quite," Thomas said. "There's still sentencing, and Boone's lawyers will probably appeal." "Let them appeal." Margaret's voice was strong. "The evidence will still be there. The truth will still be there. He's finished, and everyone knows it." Judge Blackwood emerged from the courthouse and approached them. "I wanted to speak with you all before I leave. The territory owes you a significant debt. What you've accomplished here, exposing corruption that went unchecked for 3 decades, is extraordinary." "We just told the truth," Daniel said. "Truth is never just anything." Blackwood looked at Margaret. "Mrs. Doyle, I've been in contact with the territorial governor. He's prepared to issue a formal exoneration and apology for the way you were treated. It won't undo the past, but it's a start." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you." Additionally, Mr. Boone's assets are being seized by the federal government. That includes the Broken Star Ranch and all associated properties. As victims of his crimes, you're all entitled to file claims for restitution. Blackwood handed Thomas a document. "This outlines the process. I encourage you to pursue it." After the judge left, they stood together in the cold sunshine. 4 people who'd been strangers weeks ago, now bound by shared trauma and unexpected triumph. "What will you do now?" Daniel asked Cole. "I don't know. Find work somewhere, I guess. Maybe head west? Start over where nobody knows my name." And Cole managed to smile. "What about you?" Daniel thought about his ranch, about the burned barn and the land that Boone had tried so hard to steal. Thought about the cabin where he'd spent 6 years in solitude, and about how different it had felt with Margaret there, with another human presence breaking the silence. "I'm going home," he said. "Going to rebuild what was lost. And this time I won't be doing it alone." He looked at Margaret. She looked back, understanding passing between them without words. "You'd really have me?" she asked. "After everything?" "I'd be honored." Sentencing came a week later. Judge Blackwood sentenced Silas Boone to life in prison without possibility of parole. The former sheriff, Porter, received 20 years. Several of Boone's associates and hired killers who'd been arrested as the investigation expanded received sentences ranging from 5 to 30 years. The Broken Star Ranch was liquidated, its assets distributed among Boone's victims. Margaret received a substantial settlement, enough to live comfortably for the rest of her life. Thomas inherited his grandfather's original property, which Boone had seized decades ago. Cole received back wages plus damages, and Daniel's ranch was returned to him, along with compensation for the destroyed barn and the cattle he'd lost. Winter gave way to spring slowly that year, as if the land itself was reluctant to release its hold on the cold. But eventually the snow melted, revealing brown earth that would soon turn green. The creek that gave Silver Creek its name swelled with runoff, and the first wildflowers appeared in sheltered spots along the valley floor. Daniel stood in his rebuilt barn, new timber and fresh split shingles, the smell of sawdust still hanging in the air, and looked out at his land. The barn was bigger than the old one, with room for twice as many horses and a proper loft for hay. The town had come together to build it, a collective act of apology for their years of cruelty toward both him and Margaret. People had surprising ways of seeking redemption once the object of their fear was removed. Margaret emerged from the cabin carrying 2 cups of coffee. She'd put on weight in the past months, her face less gaunt, her movements stronger. The arthritis still troubled her hands, but not as badly as it had when she'd been living on the edge of starvation. "The new fence posts came in," she said, handing him a cup. "Young Thomas brought them by this morning, said he'd help set them next week if we need it." "We'll need it. That north pasture won't fence itself." They drank their coffee in comfortable silence, watching the cattle graze on new spring grass. Daniel had bought back his herd and added to it with part of the settlement money. He had 40 head now, good stock that would provide a solid income. But more than the cattle or the rebuilt barn or the money in the bank, what he had was something he'd thought he'd lost forever. He had a home, not just a house, but a place where he belonged, where another person knew his rhythms and shared his space and made the silence less empty. "I've been thinking," Margaret said after a while, "about the Doyle property, the land that was Thomas's and James's before Boone took it. The settlement gave it back to me as next of kin." "What about it?" "I want to sell it. Use the money to start something." She looked at him. "A home for people who've got nowhere else to go. Widows, orphans, folks down on their luck. A place where they can stay until they get back on their feet. Make it so nobody has to spend 30 years being invisible like I was." Daniel smiled. Rebecca would have loved that idea. "Would you help me? I know about taking care of myself, but running something like that, I'd need help with the business side." "Of course I'll help." A rider appeared on the road from town, moving at an easy pace. As the figure drew closer, Daniel recognized Cole. He'd stayed in the area after the trial, hired on at one of the smaller ranches, but he came by regularly to help with work and share meals. He dismounted and tied his horse to the fence rail. "Morning, brought you something." He pulled a newspaper from his saddlebag and handed it to Daniel. The headline read, "Railroad Consortium announces route change, line to bypass Silver Creek Valley." Daniel read the article quickly. The railroad had decided to take a different path, one that avoided the valley entirely. Environmental concerns, the article claimed, and difficulties with the terrain. But Daniel suspected the real reason was that the federal investigation into Boone's activities had revealed so much corruption in the land deals that the railroad company had decided to avoid the entire area rather than risk association with the scandal. "Means your land's not worth what it was," Cole said. "Sorry about that." "Don't be." Daniel looked out at his ranch, at the mountains beyond, at the valley spread before him like a promise. "This land's worth more to me than any railroad money ever could be. This is where I built a life with Rebecca. This is where I learned that isolation wasn't the same as peace, and this is where I'm going to spend the rest of my days doing work that matters." "Here you're starting some kind of charitable home," Cole said to Margaret. "Thinking about it. Could use a ranch hand, someone to teach folks how to work the land, care for animals, that kind of thing." Cole looked slightly embarrassed. "If you're hiring, I mean." Margaret and Daniel exchanged glances. Then Margaret smiled. "We're hiring. Pay's not great, but room and board are included, and the work's honest." "Honest work's all I'm looking for." They shook on it there in the spring sunshine, 3 people who'd been broken by Silas Boone's greed and cruelty now beginning to build something new from the pieces. The weeks turned to months. Summer came to the valley in a rush of green and gold, the high meadows blooming with wildflowers that painted the mountainsides in riots of color. Daniel and Margaret worked side by side, their friendship deepening into something that felt like family. Not romance, but the kind of partnership that came from shared survival and mutual respect. The charitable home became a reality. They converted the old Doyle ranch house into a dormitory and dining hall, added a bunkhouse for families, and cleared land for gardens where residents could grow their own food. Word spread, and people came. A widow with 3 children whose husband had died in a mining accident, an old soldier with no family and nowhere to go, a young woman fleeing an abusive marriage. Margaret ran it all with surprising organizational skill, her years of suffering transformed into empathy that made everyone feel safe and valued. Cole taught the residents how to care for livestock and mend fences and do all the practical work that survival in the territory required. And Daniel helped with the finances and legal matters, making sure the home stayed solvent and legitimate. They called it Wright House, after Samuel Wright and his covenant to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. Thomas visited regularly, bringing supplies and news from Helena, where he'd settled and started working as a journalist. He was writing a book about his grandfather's investigation and the trial that had brought down Silas Boone, determined that the story wouldn't be forgotten. "People need to know what happens when good men stay silent," he said one evening over dinner at Daniel's cabin. "They need to understand that corruption thrives in darkness, and that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is speak the truth, even when everyone tells you to be quiet." "Your grandfather would be proud," Margaret said. "I hope so. I'm dedicating the book to him. And to you, Mrs. Doyle, because you never stopped being human even when everyone treated you like you weren't." Margaret reached across the table and squeezed his hand, too moved to speak. Autumn arrived with its familiar chill, leaves turning golden red before falling to carpet the ground. Daniel was mending fence one afternoon when he saw a rider approaching. Not Cole or Thomas, but someone he didn't recognize, a young woman with dark hair and eyes that reminded him achingly of Rebecca. She reined in her horse near where he was working. "Are you Daniel Carter?" "I am. My name is Sarah Blackwood. Judge Blackwood's my uncle. He told me about what you did, helping to bring Silas Boone to justice." She dismounted, moving with easy grace. "I'm a teacher. Been looking for a place to settle, somewhere that needs a school. Uncle mentioned that you and Mrs. Doyle are running a charitable home. Thought maybe the children there could use some education." Daniel set down his tools. "We've got 6 children at Wright House right now. None of them are getting proper schooling. We'd be grateful for a teacher." "I don't need much. Just a room and meals and maybe help building a proper schoolhouse eventually. We can manage that." Sarah smiled, and Daniel felt something shift in his chest. Not the old grief for Rebecca. That would always be there. A permanent ache that time had made bearable but not gone. This was something different. The recognition that life continued, that new people brought new possibilities, and that healing didn't mean forgetting. "Then I'll take the job," Sarah said. "When can I start?" "How about now? I'll take you to meet Margaret." As they walked toward Wright House together, Daniel thought about the path that had led him here. A handkerchief and a lie. A blizzard and an old woman freezing to death on a road. A barn burning and false charges and a desperate flight through winter darkness. Every moment had felt like an ending, like one more thing being taken away. But endings were also beginnings if you had the courage to keep moving forward. Winter came again, as it always did in Montana. The first snow fell on a November morning, covering the valley in white silence. Daniel stood on his porch watching it fall, Margaret beside him wrapped in a heavy shawl. "Year ago today you found me on the road," she said quietly. "Probably would have died that night if you hadn't." "A year ago today, I was alone and convinced I always would be," Daniel replied. "You saved me as much as I saved you. We saved each other, along with Thomas and Cole and everyone else who had the courage to stand up when it mattered." They watched the snow fall in comfortable silence. Behind them, from inside the cabin, came the sounds of dinner being prepared. Cole was cooking tonight, and Sarah had been invited to join them. From Wright House, down the valley, came the faint sound of children laughing, a sound that would have been impossible a year ago. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd just ridden past me that day?" Margaret asked. "If you'd done what everyone else did and pretended I wasn't there?" "I used to wonder about things like that," Daniel said. "Used to torment myself with all the what-ifs and might-have-beens. What if Rebecca hadn't died? What if I'd been a better husband, a stronger man? What if I could go back and change everything? And now? Now I understand that you can't build a life on what-ifs. You can only build it on what is, and what is right now is good. It's not perfect. It's not what I imagined when I was young and thought I understood how the world worked, but it's real, and it's honest, and it matters." Margaret nodded slowly. "I spent 30 years being punished for things I didn't do. Spent so long believing I was cursed that I forgot I was human. But standing here now, watching the snow fall, knowing there are people down in that house who have a safe place because we built it for them, that feels like the curse finally breaking." "Maybe it was never a curse at all," Daniel said. "Maybe it was just cruelty." And maybe the antidote to cruelty isn't revenge or justice or even truth, though those things matter. Maybe it's just refusing to let cruelty make you cruel, refusing to let it steal your humanity. They went inside as the snow fell harder, joining Cole and Sarah for dinner. They ate and talked and laughed, four people who'd all been broken in different ways now helping each other heal. Later that night, after the others had gone, Daniel sat alone by his fire and thought about Rebecca. Thought about the promises they'd made to each other and the life they'd planned and the dreams that had died with her. "I hope I've made you proud," he said to the empty room. "I hope you'd approve of what I've done, how I've tried to live. I know you'd like Margaret. She's strong like you were, brave like you were, and she's helped me remember that love isn't just about holding on to what's gone. It's about honoring it by living fully, by caring about people, by making the world a little less cruel." The fire crackled, sending shadows dancing across the walls. Outside, the wind sang through the eaves and the snow continued to fall, blanketing the valley in white. Spring would come again, it always did. And when it came, there would be work to do, fences to mend, cattle to tend, children to teach, people to help. The work of living, the work of building something that mattered from the ruins of what had been lost. But for now, in the depth of winter, Daniel was content. He had a home, he had friends, he had purpose, and somewhere in the darkness he could almost feel Rebecca smiling. The years that followed brought their own challenges and triumphs. Wright House grew, adding buildings and taking in more people who needed shelter. Sarah's school flourished, eventually becoming a proper schoolhouse that served not just the residents of Wright House, but children from all over the valley. Cole married one of the widows who'd come seeking refuge, and together they started a small ranch of their own. Thomas's book was published and became a sensation, sparking investigations into corruption in other territories and leading to reforms in how local law enforcement was overseen. He dedicated his life to journalism, becoming a voice for justice and accountability. Margaret lived another 20 years, long enough to see Wright House become an institution that helped hundreds of people, long enough to see the town of Silver Creek transform from a place of casual cruelty into a community that took pride in taking care of its own, long enough to hear people speak her name with respect instead of fear. She died peacefully in her sleep at the age of 84, surrounded by people who loved her. Daniel helped carry her coffin to the cemetery where she was buried beside Samuel Wright, the man whose covenant had saved them all. The entire town turned out for the funeral, a final apology for 30 years of exile. "She was the bravest person I ever knew," Daniel said in his eulogy. Not because she fought, not because she never gave up, but because she refused to let cruelty make her cruel. She could have spent her life seeking revenge on the people who'd hurt her. Instead, she spent it helping people who needed kindness. That's real courage. That's real strength. Daniel himself lived to be 73. He never remarried, though he and Sarah became close friends and co-directors of Wright House. He spent his final years writing down the story of what had happened, wanting future generations to understand the cost of silence and the power of standing up for truth. He died on a spring morning, the valley green and alive around him, wildflowers blooming across the meadows where his cattle grazed. They buried him next to Rebecca and their daughter Sarah, finally reunited with the family he'd lost so long ago. But his legacy lived on. Wright House continued its work. Sarah's school educated generations of children. And the story of how an old woman and a grieving rancher had brought down one of the most powerful men in the territory became legend, told and retold until it was part of the valley's identity. The barn Daniel had rebuilt still stood a century later, a monument to resilience and hope. Because sometimes the greatest victories aren't won with guns or money or power. Sometimes they're won by ordinary people who simply refuse to accept that cruelty is inevitable, who choose kindness when everyone says to choose fear, who stand up when everyone else sits down, who offer a handkerchief to a crying woman on courthouse steps and refuse to look away. That's how empires fall and how curses break and how justice, delayed for decades, finally arrives. Not with thunder or lightning, but with simple human decency repeated until it becomes something stronger than any corruption. With truth that refuses to stay buried, with courage that looks like an old woman riding 40 miles through a blizzard with bleeding hands, with love that honors the dead by serving the living. That was Daniel Carter's story. That was Margaret Doyle's story. And it ended not with tragedy or vengeance, but with wildflowers blooming in a valley where justice had finally come home.